circumstances. I really enjoyed yesterday. I'm looking forward to the discussions today. To kick things off this morning, I want to make 2 points. I want, first of all, to make the case for a distinction between two kinds of trust, both of which I think are relevant to trust in experts, and actually that I think become particularly significant when we think about trust in expertise. There's a difference between epistemic trust and what I call recommendation trust. Now, I'll go through that distinction in a bit more detail later in the presentation, but just to anticipate and to give a rough idea of what I mean by this, epistemic trust is a familiar kind of trust. It's an attitude by which I believe something on the basis of the fact that someone I trust has told me it's the case. And I think this is often what we by default think we're talking about when we talk about trust in experts. But actually there's a different kind of trust that we sometimes are also asked to extend to experts, which I call recommendation trust. And that is to accept that we should do something on the basis of the fact that it's recommended to us by someone else. I'll give a bit more of a precise account of that later in the presentation. And then second, on the basis of this distinction, and I want to be a bit more modest in this second point, and this is the more work in progress part of the presentation. I want to maintain that this distinction is helpful, it's important for when we think about the informal indicators that are appropriate to making judgments of expert trustworthiness. And more specifically, what I'm going to try to do is to make the case that some of the appropriate informal indicators for judging the epistemic trust of experts don't work as well, or may not work at all, for when we think about making judgments of recommendation trust when it comes to trust in experts. Okay, next slide. Here we go. So I want to contextualize this a little bit by drawing attention to the role that expertise plays in at least some parts of the world at the moment in the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic. This is really what got me thinking about the difference between these two different kinds of trust in science. In the UK, for example, and certainly much earlier in the UK's response to the pandemic in March and April, it's very common to see government ministers and the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, use this phrase, following the science. And I've included a picture up on the slide here from actually a recent UK government press conference. It was very common at the beginning of the pandemic in particular to see Boris Johnson addressing the nation, addressing journalists, flanked either side by this is Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer for the UK government, and Patrick Vallance, the Chief Science Officer for the government, with the message being pretty clear here that the public health response that was suggested to the public and in some cases mandated was following the science. It was something that was led by experts. And what I'm suggesting is that this brings into acute relief the difference in the kind of trust we're asked to extend to experts when they're involved in policy in this way, when they're not just presenting information to us, but they are making recommendations and even in some cases telling us what to do, hence the title of my presentation. This is the context in which I find this distinction particularly important. And so in order to see how this distinction works with regards to the judgments that we're supposed to make about trustworthiness of experts, I want to use an example from some of the literature on how we come to make judgments of the trustworthiness of experts to see whether these means for making these judgments will work for both epistemic and recommendation trust. My illustrative example comes from Elizabeth Anderson. And I include up here on the slide some criteria that Anderson has suggested novices can use in order to come to reasonable enough judgments about the trustworthiness of scientists. A little bit more detail on this. Anderson suggests that these are pretty accessible criteria that can be deployed by anyone, as she puts it, with a high school education and with a basic web literacy and, of course, access to the web. And those criteria come into 4 categories. I'm going to go through these categories briefly, one by one, just to explain a little bit more the model of trustworthiness judgment that she is proposing. So the first of these is competence. Anderson suggests we need to make judgments of competence of experts. And the informal indicator of this that she proposes is something of a credentials hierarchy. The idea is to make a quick judgment as to whether or not a particular expert we're being asked to trust is high enough on a hierarchy of scientific credentials for us to consider them to be competent in the relevant field. This is a screenshot from her paper, including most of the hierarchy that she suggests. It's detailed, it's long. I'm not going to go through it in any great detail. That's going to take too long. But one thing I do want to draw attention to is that this ranges from what Anderson calls laypersons through various stages of more progressed academic credentials specifically. So this is an academic credentials hierarchy. We go from laypersons with no university education through a bachelor's degree, through PhDs, and then leaders in the field of the relevant scientific inquiry. And that's the hierarchy that we can use to judge whether or not the relevant expert, according to Anderson, is competent. The next criteria that Anderson suggests we deploy for making these judgments is honesty. And this can be indicated in a few different ways. According to her, we can look to the track record of the scientist or the research project that we're being asked to trust. And in particular, Anderson suggests here we should be looking for evidence of past incidents of plagiarism. And we can also, according to her, look for evidence of past incidents of misrepresenting opponents. Of course, a scientist who is making the case for their own results simply by misrepresenting those who are arguing against them is not presenting their science in an honest way. And another somewhat different indicator of whether or not a scientist or an expert is dishonest is whether they have a conflict of interest. So we would probably judge, for example, that a study on the medical problems associated with cigarettes and tobacco as funded by the tobacco industry might be something that's likely to be a dishonest example, an example of dishonest science. Third criteria is what Anderson calls epistemic responsibility, and this is indicated in two ways, according to her model. The first is whether or not the scientist or the experts in question is subjecting their work to proper scrutiny by others in the field. And so a clear indicator of epistemic irresponsibility would be if an expert is evading peer review. Another clear indicator of epistemic irresponsibility would be what Anderson calls dialogic irrationality. And dialogic irrationality is when someone makes a claim and an opponent or someone who disagrees with the claim argues with it, gives arguments, reasons for thinking that the original claim isn't true, and the original scientist who made the claim in the first place completely ignores the counter-arguments, completely ignores the reasons that have been given by their opponents, and just continues to state the claim, as if to just completely block out the possibility that other people could disagree with them. This is an example of what Anderson calls dialogic irrationality, which again would be a clear indicator of epistemic irresponsibility. And if someone is epistemically irresponsible, we shouldn't be trusting them. Finally, Anderson suggests that in order to make judgments of trustworthiness, we should be looking for consensus among a community of experts. This criteria operates slightly differently to the first three criteria, because we can really only use it on Anderson's model once we've reached positive judgments with regards to competence, honesty, and epistemic responsibility. So the idea is that once we have identified a group of people who meet the first three criteria, we then, if we want to know whether we can really believe what we're being told by this group of people, we need to check whether they agree with each other. And the way that we can check this, according to Anderson, is a few different things that she thinks we can easily get by a quick Google search. These are going to be things like surveys of experts in the field, again, those who meet the first three criteria. We could look to meta-analyses of peer-reviewed science and publications. Or we could look to consensus reports by international bodies that transcend individual research projects. And a popular example of this in the literature is the International Panel on Climate Change. Now, it's worth mentioning before I go on that I don't necessarily endorse this as a good model for how novices really can reach reliable judgments of the epistemic trustworthiness of experts. There is actually a fair amount of criticism in some of the philosophy of science literature of this model and of what Anderson has proposed here. I don't want to get too bogged down into that. I think a version of this can be made practicable, and really what I want to do is to suggest a sort of conditional claim about this. And the conditional claim is, even if we can make this model work and we can answer all the critics, and we can make it work with regards to epistemic trustworthiness, it still won't do the job we need it to do for a different kind of trust. And so that different kind of trust is what I want to turn to now before I return then to reanalyze these criteria for how we judge trustworthiness. Okay, so the distinction then between epistemic and recommendation trust. Well, the first of those two, I don't think I need to say much about. I think it is very familiar. And so I'll just articulate this in terms of believing something because another person has asserted that it's true. I say asserted rather than simply told me, because when it comes to trust in experts, there's a complicated way in which experts tell us things. It isn't so straightforward as we don't sit down and have a conversation face-to-face with the chief science officer of the UK government. And so instead, we are being asked to believe something because they've said it's the case. Information about the spread of the virus, things like that. Recommendation trust is, as I said earlier in the presentation, it's believing that I should do something because another person has recommended that I do this. And of course, this is, as I've articulated this up on the slide, this is not necessarily something that has to involve trust in experts. I can believe that I should do something simply on the basis of a friend recommending that I do it, or a relative, or what have you. It needn't be someone that I consider certainly a scientific expert. But it is particularly important when it comes to the role that experts play when they have a role to lead policy in, for example, responses to pandemics, public health strategies. I'll note in passing that I do acknowledge that this isn't really anything like a definition. If you think definitions require something like a necessary and sufficient condition, there are related attitudes we can have towards people who have recommended things to us that meet this description, but don't actually look like recommendation trust. I could explain that if you'd like me to, but it probably won't help very much for the flow of the paper, so I'll just note that in passing. This is a rough and ready account, if you like. I'm also aware that there's a third kind of trust that's very often discussed in philosophical literature on trust, which is sometimes called practical trust, and this is relevant too to the way that we trust or don't trust experts in public life. Practical trust is when, roughly speaking, we stake something important on the actions of other people. And at the moment, we are staking something very important, the future of the pandemic, on a range of experts who are working on vaccines, for example. And in a way, arguably, we're trusting them to do this. But I don't want to get dragged into that very much either. There's one important there's a few differences between epistemic and recommendation trust, but there's one that is particularly important for what I want to say today, and that is with regards to the conditions that have to hold in order for these two forms of trust to be rational. I'm going to use that phrase rational, or sometimes I prefer to just say well-placed, but rational is perhaps a more familiar language to use when talking about this. But the important thing is that the conditions I'm going to say are different for rational epistemic trust and rational recommendation trust. Now, when it comes to rational epistemic trust, there's been a certain amount of discussion among philosophers and scientists about how we can render epistemic trust rational so that it can be the case that novices who are not in a position to verify various kinds of scientific claims can still nonetheless have knowledge about basic scientific facts, things like climate change is anthropogenic, or things like the world is round. If these are the things that we can't verify for ourselves in the way that we can verify lots of other beliefs that we have, then for some epistemologists, this can be a threat to knowledge about basic scientific facts. And so this is where some of this literature comes from. One very influential attempt to deal with this and to render these beliefs that are based on epistemic trust, render them rational, is, this comes from John Hardwick from a couple of papers, one of which published in 1985, in which he makes a case for this principle. And if this principle holds, according to Hardwick, then we can rationally believe and thereby have knowledge of things that we know only through the fact that other people who are experts have told us it's the case. That principle runs, if one person has good reasons to believe that another person has good reasons to believe something, then the first person has good reason to believe that thing as well. So that's a bit sort of dry. Let me give an example. If, for example, a patient were to have a conversation with their doctor about they're considering signing a do not resuscitate or do not attempt CPR order, they might have a discussion with their doctor about the information around this in order to make an informed decision. And so the doctor may tell them various things about the success rate of CPR in the home outside of hospitals, for example, or the patient may ask their doctor about previous experiences that the doctor has had with patients who have had CPR and what the results have been like. What kind of experiences have patients had once they're, say, successfully resuscitated. And this kind of information, if it's imparted by a doctor that the patient believes to be honest, to be competent, and to be in a position to tell the truth to the patient, then this, if this principle holds, the Hardwick T principle holds, then this is all reason enough for the patient to form a rational belief in all of the information that the doctor is telling them about CPR, even if the patient is not themselves in a position to verify that information. So that's principle T with regards to rational epistemic trust. Now, one question we can ask is whether we can translate this in a way that would also give us a principle that would underpin rational recommendation trust. Can we do a similar kind of thing when it comes to experts giving us recommendations? So one way we might try to do this would be to alter Hardwick's principle. And we can come up perhaps with something like this. If one person has good reason to believe that another person has good reasons to believe that they should do something, then the first person has good reason to believe that indeed they should do something. So if I'm talking with a friend about I'm going to drive somewhere and I need some traffic advice or some advice about the route I take, maybe I don't know much about what the traffic's like at the moment. Maybe I don't know much about the route and how long it's going to take me. So I defer to my friend. If I have good reasons to believe that my friend knows what they're talking about, and they say you should take route B and not route A, then that is enough for me to have good reason to believe that I should take route B. That's how this principle would work. And this would allow me to form this belief about what I should do, even if I can't verify it for myself. Now, the problem with this is that actually this isn't true. This principle doesn't hold for all cases where we're being asked to trust in the recommendation of another person. So if you think again about the discussion between the patient and the doctor, if the doctor, rather than just giving information about, say, the success rate of CPR, was to tell the patient, on the basis of this, I think you should sign a do not resuscitate order. If you set aside the medical ethics problems with this, huge medical ethics problems in doctor suggesting that, set that aside, and then just think about whether the doctor suggesting that, recommending that, gives the patient enough reason for them to accept that this is something they should do. It doesn't, even if the patient still believes that the doctor is honest, is sincere, and is competent and knows what they're talking about. And the reason why this is not enough reason for the patient to think that, yes, I should do this, is that there's still the possibility that what the doctor values and what the patient values could come apart. The doctor's technical expertise and competence and their knowledge of the facts is not enough for the patient to think this is a recommendation that I should accept. So, for example, the doctor may be basing their recommendation on the fact that they've seen people previously successfully resuscitated in situations where the resuscitation has really just allowed for a very slight extension of life, let's say for a few days, and in incredible pain. And this whole thing has been very upsetting for the patient and for the family. And so this is something that they want other patients to avoid too. Now, the patient themselves is still in a position where they need to weigh up their values between, for example, a dignified and painless end of life and the very value of extending their life itself, or you might say the sort of sanctity of life. And if a patient is committed to something like the sanctity of life, then they may rationally come to the decision that despite the recommendation from the doctor, they want to be resuscitated if it's at all possible. So because of a potential divergence in values, even though the doctor may be technically unquestionable, this is not enough for the recommendation to be something that the patient should accept. What we need instead is in order for recommendations from experts or from anybody to be considered trustworthy, we need to know that the recommendations are coming from someone who understands my values and interests. And so we need to have an altered version of that principle if we're going to render recommendation trust in any circumstances trustworthy or rational. And so what I'm suggesting as a response to this is an adapted version of this principle. If one person has good reasons to believe that another person has good reasons to believe that the thing they're suggesting is in the first person's interests, then that first person has good reasons to believe that they should do it. And so if the patient believes not just that the doctor is competent in their field, but that they also understand the values and the interests of the patient, then that is enough for them to think, I can trust this recommendation. Okay, so let me then, in the few minutes I have remaining, return to this question of whether the indicators that Anderson has suggested for epistemic trust can help us with recommendation trust. I might have to run through this fairly quickly. I'm going to start with those that I think do translate. When we think about the honesty of experts who are giving us recommendations, well, at the very least, we need to know that they're not being dishonest. And we need to know that when they are explaining to us the reasons for why wearing masks or taking a vaccine or doing certain other things as part of a public health strategy is a good thing for us, we need to at least know that they do really believe it. And they're not basing their results on dishonest science. So that for me gets a thumbs up for recommendation trust. Epistemic responsibility also in brief, I think translates. Certainly, we don't want those experts who are giving us recommendations to be guilty of dialogic irrationality. Remember, that is to really just not listen to criticisms and arguments against what they're saying. So if a public health expert is to maintain that the public should be doing various kinds of things, and different public representative groups are responding with arguments against that, and the expert is just not listening, this is an example of dialogic irrationality, and we don't want that. And so this criteria seems to work, I think, in the same way. Again, that gets a thumbs up from me. More problematic are the other two criteria. Competence, you'll remember, at least in the indicators that are used by Anderson, is really a matter of scientific and more narrowly academic competence. And the thing about scientific or academic competence is that it is at least not a guarantee that the people who are making recommendations or telling us what is best for us to do will really understand the values and the interests that I really have. This works at the level of the patient-doctor example, but it also, I think, probably is more likely to occur in the relation between publics and experts who are involved in policy. And it could also, this is also not just the case that it might not guarantee an alignment of recommendations and interests, but it may well even give publics reason to think that if an expert is particularly high or has spent their whole life, say, working in an academic field, that this makes them even less likely to understand the interests and values of members of the public. So this may not just be not enough, but it might actually undermine the trustworthiness of an expert with regards to their understanding of values and interests. And then finally, with regards to consensus, this I'm not entirely sure about, so feedback would be great. But what I want to say is that members of the public can come to the conclusion that a body of scientists do all agree with regards to a particular thing to do with the factual matters around, say, a pandemic. And they may come to a consensus around the recommendation, what we should be doing. But if members of the public also have reason to think that those same scientists don't have a very good understanding of the values and the interests of various members of the public, then the fact that they come to a consensus isn't going to help. A bunch of scientists who don't understand what I want and what's good for me or what I prefer to do doesn't it's not going to help if all of those scientists who don't understand me all agree with themselves, with each other, because again, this could diverge from what I really think are my own values and interests. I'm at my 25 minutes, and I was going to suggest a way that we can perhaps adjust this model, but I'll ask the moderators, can I take maybe 1 more minute just to explain this?
Yes, but we're going to be quick about it.
We're going to be quick. Okay. We're going to shorten the discussion. Yeah.
Okay. So sorry for running over. Very briefly, one alternative indicator that rather counterintuitively we could perhaps invoke in order to allow members of the public to come to a judgment about a group of scientists actually understanding their values and interests would be cultural cognition. An instance of cultural cognition would be a judgment as to whether or not a particular person, a scientist or a group of scientists, are within or not within my socially salient group. An example of this would be something that I mentioned in one of the Q&As yesterday, which is in the US, the National Medical Association, a group of African-American physicians forming their own task force to vet the claims that will be made in future about the FDA and the CDC about vaccines, in order for them to then present this in a more trustworthy way to African-Americans. That's the kind of thing I have in mind as a potential solution. Very sorry for running over. I'll draw this to a close, and then we can have whatever time we have for questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Matt. So we can now open the discussion, and we're going to stop at 11:45, so we have 12 minutes for the discussion. Maria and Christina. Maria.
Okay. Hi, Matt. Good to see you online.
Hi.
So, there's a lot about your paper that I like very much. I have one worry, or a few worries, but I'll discuss one of them. I think question of value and interest can come apart in ways that might undermine your argument about trustworthiness of experts. So I'm thinking of taking your medical case, the standard example of Jehovah's Witnesses and their refusal to have blood transfusion. So a doctor who gives testimony that blood transfusion is good for this particular person whose life is in danger, let's say, is working in the interest of the patient, but against his values. So, and you can multiply the examples in case of COVID, etc., libertarian values versus what is good for the society and so on. But you get the point. So I'd just like to hear what you have to say on this.
Yes, great. Thank you. Yeah, I've hedged my bets somewhat in using both of these terms together. I actually understand interests in this context to have the same kind of ambiguity that I think you're alluding to in what I've been saying. So interests here could mean either within a UK medical framework, best interests, as in this is in the interests of the patient, whether they know it or not. Or it could mean the things that I want to achieve, or the things that I value, and the ends that I want to pursue. Interests there being more subjective, you might say. So in my way of understanding what can make recommendation trust rational, I want to leave both of those things open, because I think there are going to be instances where it must be the case that the expert can show the novice whose trust they're soliciting that what they're recommending is something that is in accordance with their interests in the subjective sense. There must be instances where that's the case. But you're right, there are also going to be, say, medical instances where experts are turned to not just to tell us how do I get what I want, but also to tell us what is it that I should be pursuing? What is good for me in a more objective sense? I think I can account for what recommendation trust is in a way that leaves both of those things open. And then, of course, there are going to be, as you say, cases like Jehovah's Witness where these two things clash and they collide. I'm afraid I don't have anything particularly intelligent to say about that, but then we get into discussions of medical paternalism, what have you, and tricky ethical areas. I'm going to sidestep that for now, if I may.
Thank you, Maria and Matt. And Christina has a question.
Yes, Matt, thank you for a good presentation. Yeah, I think that the distinction between epistemic trust and recommendation trust is really important. And actually, I have a bit of similar question than this Maria presented. I'm also concerned that, of course, it would be, well, this is not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily undermine your argument at all, but it would be nice to hear a bit more. How should this, the person who trusts the expert and the expert, so if there is a situation where the expert has a different idea about what's in the other person's interest, so how are they going to then continue to solve this sort of difference in their ideas, and especially it's like maintaining the trust here. So I guess what I'm sort of like trying to, so how are they going to sort of signal this goodwill and that basically, you know, the person is seriously thinking about your interest, even though you don't like understand the interest yourself? I mean, it sounds like, you know, the conflicts between parents and kids typically of, but it would be interesting to have a bit more development of that. So.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think this is a good opportunity to do that. So I imagine that when we get into a situation where what an expert thinks is in somebody's interest and what that person thinks is in their interest, when they diverge, and a discussion needs to ensue about which of the two are right about this, we then move away from trust altogether, almost altogether. And what I mean by this is that I take both epistemic and recommendation trust to be needed when the novice is not in a position to reason through the conclusions that the expert are suggesting is the case. And so if instead we shift from deferring to experts to engaging in a dialogue with experts about what the best thing to do is, and the more we engage in that dialogue, the less we're relying on trust for people to come to a conclusion that they think is correct. And instead what we have is a matter of, well, I'm actually working through the reasons with the expert myself. This might not be, I mean, that's not going to be something that's appropriate in complicated scientific matters, matters of fact that underpin whatever discussion that we're having. But if, say, a patient and a doctor are to have a debate or a deliberation about what is really in their interest, then I think what we have is again a kind of process of kind of dialogical reasoning, where once the patient, let's say the patient comes to agree with the expert, they're not doing it on trust anymore. They're doing it because they've had the reasons explained to them.
Yeah, thanks. That's interesting.
Yeah, that doesn't fully answer the question, but I think that would have to be part of the answer. Let's put it that way.
And Jaron also has a question.
Hi, Matt. Thank you indeed for a very important point to make this distinction between epistemic trust and recommendation trust. I follow up on that as well. First, it struck me that I found it so important because it sort of resonates the distinction between is and ought, right? So these are different stuff, facts and values, etc. So I'm thinking from the perspective of that you give sort of a philosophical argument for a sociological phenomena where you see all kinds of people doing, according to experts, irrational stuff or making irrational choices. While you actually show that that is not irrational from the perspective of that they trust these people. So you could have Trump supporters doing all kinds of stuff that ordinary scientists would say is irrational. I think that's very... to your end. Yeah. No, go ahead, and then I will get back to your cultural cognition point.
No, so I think I'm because I thought you were finished, but it may have been a broken internet connection, so go ahead.
Okay, so this was just a comment that I think this is very important because people see a lot of people making irrational choices, while actually it makes sense because when you take an advice, you need to trust that person in the sense of does it align with my values, etc. So I think it's important. But I wanted to give some feedback on the cultural cognition point where you say that you should actually have then sort of maybe spokespersons from certain communities to endorse certain claims. And I wanted to point to, for example, the fact in Holland the government has been paying all kinds of influencers to reach like young publics in order to comply with mitigation measures, etc. And the funny thing is that when first it was not obvious to the public that they were actually paid, and later on that became clear, and that really made these influencers much more distrusted and actually seen as like traitors or fake. So I was curious if you develop this, I think it's very important that these spokespersons come up from bottom up instead of being hired by experts or governments, etc., to do their work. I was curious how you relate to that.
That's a really good example. Thank you. And tricky. Yeah, okay, so a really interesting additional factor is the trustworthiness of the spokespersons themselves. And of course, no reason to think that those same spokespersons or representative organizations shouldn't themselves also be subject to the same or similar criteria of whether they are indeed trustworthy. I mean, for one thing, there's a different way of thinking about competence. I didn't quite give myself time to talk this through in a way that I should have done. There's scientific competence and there's competence with regards to the interests and values of a particular community. And these are two different kinds of competence, but at the same time, both of them can be subject to scrutiny. And so it might well be the case that certain representatives, upon reflection or upon further analysis, don't turn out to be very good spokespeople, partly because they don't actually understand the community they're supposed to be speaking for. And then, of course, another way we could deploy Anderson's criteria in an altered fashion to these spokespeople would be to look at their honesty and their conflict of interest. And that's exactly, or it sounds to me, it's exactly what was at issue in the case that you've just described. That's what makes it so interesting. So, yeah, thank you for the example. Thank you.
Okay, last brief question from Roland Stout.
Okay, thank you very much. Matt, I thought that was very important and helpful. I just wondered whether you would be willing to extend the idea that there's more than one way of thinking about trust and therefore indicators of trust beyond just making recommendations, but also to making imperatives, instructions. So if the experts, Boris Johnson and the couple around him, aren't just saying something like, it's in your interest to do such and such, but they're saying, do such and such. You should do such and such. And it's got nothing to do with their interests, it's just telling them what to do. And do you agree that the issue of trust arises there as well? And then will there be different indicators and a different analysis that we'd have to do for that?
Good, thank you. Hi, Roland. So I think that the question of trust does arise here. I think theoretically it's not supposed to, because it's supposed to be mandated, and thereby to be the motivation, if you like, for compliance is supposed to be a response to the obligation of the law, rather than simply trusting that this is, in some sense, the right thing to do. Having said that, the likelihood that the obligation can be comprehensively policed and enforced is so slim that voluntary compliance is going to be a necessary part of this. So then that raises the question of what would make for a trustworthy mandate or directive from the government if it's led by science. I don't have a good answer to that. What I think is that in order to reach an answer, we would have to perhaps compare. I think we would have to think about what would be also good indicators for political legitimacy. And the reason for that would be that I think as a citizen, if I am asked to comply with law or government directive, if I can reach a positive judgment about this being legitimate, then I'm probably also in a position to trust it. So these two things dovetail, if you like. That would be my first stab at that.
Good, thanks very much.
Okay, I'm sorry. I think we should stop here for the discussion. And so sorry, Torbjörn, you can ask your questions by through the chat or by email. And switch to Hugh Desmond, who's going to speak about trustworthiness of professions and why status is a subordinate to service. Thank you, Hugh.
Okay, hello everybody. I'll just share presentation. Okay, so everybody can see this now. Yeah. Okay. Hello everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to connect with other people working on this topic. I have the impression that when it comes to the topic of trust, it's possible to hit this topic from many different angles. As you'll see, I've been working, I have a background more in philosophy of biology and applied ethics as well. So I'm happy to connect with other philosophers hitting this from different angles. I also note that two colleagues from the KU Leuven are also panelists, colleagues I didn't know. So there's nothing like an international conference to get to know the colleagues in your home institution. So that being said, topic today will indeed be how focusing on status and its particular role as indicator for trustworthiness. Status, of course, being a very important indicator, very central for our psychology. And that's also my starting observation. Our psychology is built up in such a way that it is de facto used as an indicator of trustworthiness via various cognitive biases. We're biased towards learning, listening, imitating high-status individuals, called the prestige bias. And so it's a philosophical talk. I'm inquiring about the more normative epistemological side. And to what extent is it justified that status is taken as an indicator of trustworthiness? Is someone's high status a good reason to trust them? And the focus on professions in particular is not arbitrary. Professions are still one of the most trustworthy occupations, despite all the conspiracy theorists and distrust and expert advice. The following slide is a recent Ipsos poll, a survey across 23 countries, global selection. Scientists and doctors are up there at the top as most trustworthy categories in society, and I highlighted, ordinary men or women there as benchmark. Of course, you can see lawyers and judges are trusted less. Lawyers and judges, of course, being instances of legal professions. But if you want to compare it then to other occupations that are not professionalized, for instance, advertising executives or politicians generally, unsurprisingly, judges and lawyers are still trusted more than they are. So as a quick overview of the talk to allow you to have kind of a roadmap, first going to lay out a kind of a classic structure to two basic views, in my view, too extreme, where status is kind of an unquestioned, reliable indicator of trustworthiness versus status being an indicator of a lack of trustworthiness. And I'm going to involve a somewhat evolutionary perspective, evolution of status hierarchies, and kind of draw the ethics out of that to argue for a type of middle position. And I'll finish with some normative implications for expert communication. So two basic views. The first is the kind of straightforward view that, well, if someone obtains a position of high status in society, it's the process by which that occurred was not arbitrary. A doctor has high status. Having the position of a doctor, the license, the medical license, it's an indicator what of competence, have undergone a certain education, certain training, and also of having what I call here a service-oriented intention. So, doctors are expected to abide by a certain code of ethics. And so taken together, status, definitely when it comes to professions, in particular, status is a reliable indicator of trustworthiness. And drawing here on the sociology of the professions, if one could call it the traditional view of the professions, this is exactly in the line with that traditional view. So in this traditional view, and I put there a screenshot of Elliot Friedson, Professionalism, the Third Logic, which is locus classicus of this traditional view. Professionals are viewed as guided in their decision making by service ideals, these type of platonic ideals of justice, care. If you go through the codes of ethics for lawyers or for doctors and so on, they refer to these type of platonic ideals. And the view of autonomy, so the traditional view of the professional autonomy, is that it's merely a means towards giving a better service for clients, for patients, and so on. Why is this necessary? Because of the esoteric nature of the knowledge involved. So that is why, for instance, only doctors can evaluate their own work, and non-doctors do not have the requisite knowledge to evaluate it. So that's why professional autonomy is so important. Okay, so the traditional view. Non-traditional view also has a long history, so tradition doesn't necessarily indicate the age of the view, but it's more of a skeptical view where status is an indicator of what I call an individual or collective egoism, hence a lack of trustworthiness. So just a little clarification there. So one can still choose to trust a high status individual. You can still, even if you're skeptical towards status, you can still choose to trust a doctor because you have formed certain beliefs about their medical training, even though you may believe that this particular doctor is only motivated by status-related reasons. So you may still choose to trust despite their status. So the issue here is the relation between status per se and trustworthiness. And so what's the basic reasoning here? It's a little bit of a construction. I don't believe it's a straw man. I'll kind of illustrate that afterwards. But the basic reasoning here is, well, one, status is a fundamental motivation of human behavior. It's kind of conventional wisdom, but it's also backed up by systematic observations. So regardless of culture, gender, age, personality, status, and striving towards status is a fundamental motivation. It also has a large impact on someone's health and happiness. Also, a lot of systematic observations about that, and the references are there below for any interested. And so what's crucial here now is that status is a positional good. So think about doctors. There's only a limited number of licenses that can be given. There's a barrier of entry into the profession. There's a selection. So it's a positional good. Status must be competed for via investment in education, career, work, so on. So it takes effort to acquire, takes effort to maintain. And so this type of reasoning then culminates in some kind of inference then about the intentions of high status individuals, namely that those with high status must have been significantly focused on their own particular good, not the good of the community per se, but their own particular good, their own standing in life. So that's on the good for others. Now, this is a somewhat crude form of reasoning. I would immediately like to, strengthen that by a more sophisticated form, because you could even be skeptical of high status individuals, even if you would grant that the individuals themselves might have had some idealistic motivations. And this, here we come now closer to the position of sociologists. So status needs to be competed for collectively, right? And this instills a culture within a profession of prioritizing not the purely individual good of this doctor or that doctor, but rather the interests of the professional community. And so the inference is less than about an individual intention, but about a collective intention. So the high status of a professional then signals that they've been embraced, taken in, and afterwards then also protected by privileged, powerful, prestigious institutions. So this is just kind of an intuitive reconstruction of a reasoning and quite plausible reasoning why one could think status in itself is an indicator for a lack of trustworthiness. But one can discern this reasoning, for instance, in the sociology of professions, referring here to Larson. I mean, this goes back. Larson draws on Gramsci, so this line of thought goes back to Marx, of course. And so, Larson emphasizes how professional organizations are primarily a means to maximize status. Safeguarding competent service is secondary. Not unimportant, but it's secondary. So she, for instance, refers to the 19th century. So, purely from perspective of competence, scientific competence, or service of care towards patients. Of course, doctors up until the 19th century were pretty incompetent, and competence not very distinguishable from their illegitimate peers, yet the legitimate doctors were accorded much more status than their illegitimate rivals. And so Larson takes this as one of the key illustrations of how power dynamics are at play in the allocation of status. The university is part of this status competition. There's a lot to be said about it. One of the core things is, for instance, how academic debates can actually become a proxy for competition between professions. Abbott is another sociologist who goes along that line of reasoning. It's a great book about that. One of his main examples were the rivalries between psychiatrists and spiritualism practitioners in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Psychiatrists won, and to this day, they do have the main jurisdiction over the treatment of mental illness, even though, of course, there's a lot of skepticism about the effectiveness of that. Sociology of the professions. Want to quickly refer to policy. As is well known, professions themselves have undergone considerable changes in the past 30 to 40 years. In the UK, the term new public management covers a lot of that. So code words, accountability, transparency. And what does that come down to? Sociologists describe this as the hybridization of professionalism. So more bureaucracy, more external control. And also little reference to Honora O'Neill, who kind of popularized this in the community of philosophers in her 2002 series of lectures. Conspiracy theories, of course, a much cruder form of reasoning, but similarly often status itself seems to be taken as an indicator for lack of trustworthiness. So conspiracy theories involve powerful agents who are not trustworthy, and their status seems to be a direct indicator for corruption or ulterior motives. So just a quick reference there to empirical studies about why precisely people distrust the human papilloma virus vaccination, and the considerations that doctors are out to reduce world population or are in concert with large pharmaceutical companies. Okay, so kind of two clearly delineated views, and plausibly, I mean, I think it's fair to say, of course, you may push back on that, but I think it's fair to say that these views are relatively well represented in public discourse even today. And I now kind of want to critically examine status itself and try to identify some kind of middle position, leaning more towards status as an indicator for trustworthiness, so a bit more critical of the skeptical stance, but nonetheless allowing that status, there's some residual risk involved in trusting high status individuals, and so that I think that that's been underestimated often. So, and then finish with some implications for expert communication. I keep an eye on the time. Function of status differences are to, just from perspective of evolutionary biology, they're to minimize intergroup conflict. So, a group of chickens with a pecking order will have less conflict than one without. They'll have to, they'll be constantly fighting, conflicting about who gets what. And from a more abstract mathematical perspective, this can be given grounding in Arrow's theorem and decision theory. So when you have three or more people, a group of three or more people with three or more options, there is often no way so that everybody can get their main choice. So there needs to be some kind of dictatorship, that's Arrow's term, to break the symmetry between the participants and to come to a collective conclusion. And so status hierarchies are one way of breaking this symmetry when there are a large number of actors with a large number of options to choose from. A typical distinction is made between dominance and prestige, two types of status. Dominance achieved through force or threat of force. Prestige being voluntarily given, achieved through possessing some skill or competence others can learn from, and prestige hierarchies are either unique or pretty unique to Homo sapiens, reflect the centrality of social learning and culture for the human species. And so from an ethical perspective, this prestige hierarchies are interesting because they represent ways of organizing status hierarchies according to the communal good, according to whether the individual has offered a service to the community. And so actually a lot of anthropologists that put their reference to Price and von Vught talk about prestigious individuals being constrained by service for prestige norms. So if somebody is accorded high status, but then they obviously act in self-interest, that they are often punished, and sometimes quite severely. So what's kind of the takeaway from this? It's not sufficient to understand status in terms of rewards alone, kind of privilege. Often people talk about privilege, but there's not enough attention for the process by which status differences arose. What are the criteria? Was it merit? Was it being a family member, nepotism? Was it physical strength, as it is with most non-human species? And of course, this issue is it's a little bit, it sounds scientific, but it's of course intimately related to one of the central questions of political philosophy, question of justice. But what's interesting here is that evolutionary anthropology identifies prestige hierarchies where status is conferred according to the criterion of service. And so then I would argue for the ethical conclusion here, or epistemological in a certain sense as well. So given prestige hierarchies, high status can be considered as a reliable indicator of trustworthiness, sorry. It's not only an indicator of competence or skill, but also of the willingness of the individual to use that competence for the good of the community. So it also reflects something about the intentions of the individual. So given that condition in an ethos of service, where these norms of service for prestige are default, status can be a reliable indicator of trustworthiness. Right? And so that's in theory, that's kind of the abstract argument. Of course, immediately a nuance should be added to that an ethos of service is some kind of ideal, and that actual human cultural and social environments are not perfectly characterized by these service for prestige ideals. So, for instance, especially in contemporary institutionalized societies, it's not always easy to know whether status involves prestige or dominance. So one of the classic examples here, like Henrik as I'll give, are job titles. So on the one hand, these job titles signify competence, but they can also signify the power to hire or fire, to promote or demote members of that organization, and so actually also signify a form of dominance, a threat of force. Second, prestigious individuals can easily convert their prestige into dominance. They have large social networks, which they can use then to suppress rivals. And finally, what I call identity risk, which is, it's slightly more difficult to measure, but nonetheless seems to be very important in my judgment of the public discourse. So conferring high status gives kind of a risk on the part of the low status individual of a lack of dignity, a feeling of not being heard. And this is kind of backed up by some systematic observations. So low status humans are ascribed less agency, sadly also less humanity. Now these studies referred to here, there's a lot of stuff in connection to racism about this, but that particular study was one that was compared North Italians and South Italians, so it's a purely class thing. And also well documented and referred to earlier how this lack of feeling of agency, according to some, is an important factor of these divergence in health outcomes within societies. Marmot looked at the UK in particular. And now to kind of wrap up the implications for expert communication. Often there's an emphasis placed on the importance of misinformation, fake news, how with social media people can't decide for themselves anymore what's reliable, what isn't. They're easily misled. Often this emphasis ignores the role played by how active the distrust is of the so-called elite. Gloria, I didn't know this, a figure, Didier Raoult in France, also talking about the elite in particular, as if being part of the elite is itself an indicator of lack of trustworthiness. So there seems to be some active element involved, choosing not to trust. I have here a citation from a recent book of Heidi Larson about vaccination and skepticism towards vaccination. And she talks about how the vaccine skeptics have this sense of lost dignity, sentiment of feeling excluded, not consulted in planning, lack of transparency, feeling ignored. And so kind of with the information I gave in this presentation, that this is like entirely not surprising, because this is part and parcel of there being status differences, and in particularly unhealthy status differences. So, and now in closing, in particular, what ways can experts exert dominance? Because often we associate them with kind of a prestige, voluntarily given status, but they also have some kind of actual control over behavior. For instance, they can shape opinions of political leaders, now in one country more than in the other country, but in every country, let's say more so than ordinary lay people. In that way, they shape legislation, and they set social standards, which has been quite apparent in the COVID pandemic. So in some countries like Belgium, where I live, wearing a mouth mask is a quasi-moral standard, but you go north to Holland and definitely in Scandinavia, and it's not a moral norm at all there. So I would argue then from this that it's important that experts don't take the trust for granted, that they recognize that there is some residual risk for people in trusting high status individuals, and experts are high status individuals. They're on the news all the time. They shape opinion. Maybe they're not wealthy, but they do have very large influence, and in general, they're given a voice, right? So their intentions impact to a very large degree the collective intentions, and that's kind of the most fundamental definition of status. And so their communication can shape understanding, but they can also shape norms and shape action. So if there's some, policymakers and the public demand that they come to a conclusion, that they shape norms. They want to know what should we do now. But if the first ideal of conveying understanding is compromised too much, we end up with a type of paternalism. That's why I would argue that it's from the framework that I've sketched here, it's important that experts demonstrate their trustworthiness. So that's in conclusion. Skepticism towards status is not justified, however, only given an ethos of service. But even then, trusting high status individuals involves some risk, even if they're highly competent. So experts should be aware of this dynamic and place greater emphasis on demonstrating trustworthiness.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thank you, Hugh. We have run a little bit out of time, so we're going to have 10 minutes for the discussion. Any question from the panelists or the... Mauricio? Martins?
Hi. I was wondering, maybe it is true that high status in principle correlates with competence and with benevolence if it is based on prestige. But maybe for the generality of the population, it can be kind of hard to assess whether that high status was achieved because of competency in bringing kind of common good, if you want, or due to other reasons. And when they see experts that make recommendations that turn out to be wrong, then it's easy to generalize and say all experts don't know what they're really talking about, or they are, even if they know, they're lying to us. So I wonder how could the general population make a better distinction between those experts that actually are competent and have your interests, a good interest in mind, and the ones that don't. And maybe that's the problem, this opacity of ability to determine who are the good experts and the bad ones.
Yeah. Yeah, no, of course, I didn't go into much detail on how precisely this ethics of expert communication would work, but I think competence can be taken in different ways. So competence can mean knowledge. But an important part of kind of professional deontology, and I would say also scientific deontology, is knowing the limits of your knowledge as well. And so, in a certain sense, when experts have made very definite pronouncements which have turned out to be wrong, sometimes that is generally due to changing evidence. But sometimes, or often, it has been due to them not entirely conveying the uncertainty involved in the scientific situation still. So I would say that one way in which trustworthiness could be demonstrated would be to be a bit more forthcoming about the uncertainty involved in the science itself. And so when making pronouncements or recommendations, that one acknowledges that perhaps the science is not entirely sure, but yet it might still be the best course of action. And so I think the onus is still on experts to convey a kind of a more transparent reasoning process in that sense.
Jacopo Domenicucci.
Thank you very much. I really loved your talk. I wanted to know more about this idea of the ethics of service and the importance you give to it for trustworthiness, because I get why it's very important, but I was wondering whether you think it is naturally sufficient in the sense that service seems to be something that you always do towards someone. You're always serving something or someone or a specific cause. So in a sense, it leaves open the question about whether whether the service is aligned with the interests of the public, or if at least it's perceived this way. For example, you may think of two kinds of conspiracy theorists. The first think, oh, these experts are individually untrustworthy because they individually have this conflicting interests with us, or they have this problem that they don't want to serve us for whatever reason. And you have another kind who thinks, well, actually they do have an ethics of service, but it's just the wrong service. And I mean, it can be a conspiracy theorist, or it can just be someone who's a militant and who's in a context where, for example, the experts who have a good ethics of service actually have an interest, I don't know, in permitting certain privacy ideas about privacy that actually help the service but do not help the public. Imagine the context of a surveillance state, for example. So I was wondering if there were more constraints you would put on this idea of the ethics of service to ensure that there's a good alignment between all the interests, or if you think that actually the idea of the ethics of service is a broader one. I mean, it's a stronger one that ensures the alignment with the public already, and we don't need this kind of consideration.
Yeah, well, I mean, indeed, a service kind of almost by definition entails some kind of communal good. But of course, that doesn't obviate the need for your question, because what does it precisely mean? And so there seem to be two different situations then kind of like implicit in your question. One is that the individuals could have kind of good and prima facie trustworthy intentions, but yet because of being embedded in some kind of organization, in the end their actions could be led away from what could be considered a communal good. And the second is then that in doing their service, for instance, serving health, that they then compromise other values, and so in the end, in pursuing a particular service, end up damaging individuals in some other way. And I think that, for instance, that latter has been argued, or is being argued quite a bit now in context of expert communication in particular, so that it's not a good idea to only have medical professionals deciding the guidance, because public health is much more complicated than kind of the epidemiology of a disease alone. You need to take into consideration the economy and how that might have an impact on mental health of people and so on. And so I think there is, service is just a label. Of course, what it means, a service and capacity of a doctor or a medical professional might mean something very different from the service of a scientist, which in turn then might mean something quite different from an expert on national stage shaping social norms and policy. So I think it can be integrated, but of course, in order to develop it, more detail would be needed, but wasn't quite the main goal of this presentation.
Thank you very much.
Well, I have a brief question. It's just a question of clarification. I didn't get the point on dominance and experts. How experts can exert dominance in their status, in their statutory position?
Yeah, so prestige is, in that literature, often understood as voluntarily given, whereas dominance is kind of taken, that there's that element of voluntariness is absent. And there are situations, Matt was kind of touching on this a little bit, on how expert opinion can kind of ignore many actors or agents in society. And so that would be one instance, for instance, of dominance where, like a conflict threatens, but the experts kind of, put their status on table and then just avoid the conflict but get their way. So that would be a form of dominance. Yeah. Whereas prestige kind of, it implies that there's some kind of consensus involved, that they actually kind of trust. I mean, these anthropologists don't use the word trust, but it's implied.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think we can switch to the last presentation for this session, Jaron. Harambam, Distrusting the Experts, Conspiracy Theories, and their alternative indicators of trustworthiness. So, Jaron.
Yes. Hi. Hello. Good morning or good afternoon already. Let me first share my screen. All right. So good afternoon. My name is Jaron Harambam. I'm a sociologist currently working at the Institute for Media Studies at KU Leuven. My research is on conspiracy theories and public disputes over truth. And I will speak today about my PhD research of a few years ago and my current research that was hijacked by the corona pandemic. Since there were a lot of conspiracy theories from the start about the corona pandemic. So I will first highlight a few of the conspiracy theories that emerged. So at the start, there were, of course, many doubts about the origins of the virus. Did it actually come from the Wuhan market, as the official narrative is, or did it maybe escape from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, or maybe it was a bioweapon by the United States put there to discredit the Chinese? There were, of course, conspiracy theories about the relationship between corona or COVID-19 symptoms and the 5G networks that were being enrolled over there. There were many conspiracy theories about the role of Bill Gates and his foundation and his push for vaccines and his involvement in the vaccine development. There were many concerns about a sort of a coming totalitarian government, the pandemic as it was called, involving all kinds of totalitarian regime changes that would happen. There were also many conspiracy theories about the numbers that were being displayed in public debates, the mortality rates, the amount of infections, the numbers of COVID-19 deaths. Why were there so many? For example, this example of healthcare workers that turned out that to make the point that actually these were people that are already retired. So even there was a lot of discussion about the numbers that are being displayed in public debates. There were many conspiracy theories as well about the measures that were being taken and the infringements on human rights, etc., that were being brought about, the police violence against all kinds of people that didn't comply with the rules. Of course, there were many conspiracy theories about the possible medications and cures against corona or COVID-19 symptoms. So the most famous one is, of course, the hydroxychloroquine debate that we saw in the first keynote, Gloria, is still very vibrant in the conspiracy world. And like here, we also have an example of a Dutch doctor who claimed as well that this was a very viable strategy, and he was being expelled by the Dutch medical board of pursuing this strategy, and that caused a lot of conspiracy theories as well. Why is it being pushed out of official guidelines? So if you have a look at all the conspiracy theories that were out there, I would like to sort of review them, all of them together. So you see a lot of conspiracy theories about the origins of the virus, about the relation between the virus and the illness. Why do some people get ill and others not? A lot of worries about the totalitarian regime that were coming. There were worries about mandatory vaccination, concerns about the proportionality of the mitigation measures, the possible cures and medications, the role of the WHO, of philanthropy as Bill Gates Foundation, and the role of Big Pharma in this all, and the measurements that were being used to legitimize public mitigation measures. At the same time, there was also a very large conspiracy theory panic, as you could call it. A lot of newspaper articles, television shows, and even the WHO calling the spread of all kinds of misinformation the second, or actually maybe a bigger threat to public health than the virus itself. And also, you saw very quickly social media platforms for the first time actually very aggressively removing all kinds of content that didn't comply with WHO guidelines of what would be actually true. Now, the interesting thing is that very quickly as these conspiracy theories emerged, there also were more official stories of collusion and cover-up regarding these same items. So Washington Post disclosed how actually CIA was already warning of warning for the safety that was actually there at the Wuhan lab of virology. There were issues there that they already mentioned 2 years ago, and these cables were coming out and sort of legitimizing the conspiracy theory fears that were out there. And this became entangled with all kinds of geopolitical games that were being played out with mainstream news outlets. And the same was about the possible medications and cures that were there in the whole scientific debate around possible cures. So, for example, we had this big Lancet retraction of a large influential paper that actually made the WHO stop all experiments all over the world with the hydroxychloroquine medication trials. And here this also alludes to the fact of how much of an illusion are these conspiracy theories regarding the role of, for example, big pharma in pushing certain medications and suppressing others. The same counts with the fact whether transmission of the virus was actually going through little droplets or it was more airborne in the terms of aerosols. And WHO is also, resisting this new developments and new research that was coming out, also fueling the legitimacy of all kinds of conspiracy theories about certain agendas being pushed by certain actors. Now, what does science say about these corona conspiracy theories? Very quickly, there were all kinds of articles and commentaries arguing that the coronavirus conspiracy theories are very much sort of a cognitive coping strategy of people that do not really understand what is going on. So they have a huge complexity, and these conspiracy theories will bring back order and meaning and give people a sense of assurance and agency. They understand what is going on, and this gives comfort and solace in these difficult times. Now, so the same sort of narrative is being forwarded, that these conspiracy theories are actually flawed, paranoid, and irrational, but as such, they have sort of a function that gives back people the idea that they really can understand what is going on. Now, the interesting thing is that this, of course, rings true, and there is some truth in that, but at the same time, it also has some problems. For example, that it pathologizes these conspiracy theories, and more importantly, that it disregards all these differences between these conspiracy theories, arguing that there is a relationship between 5G and the coronavirus is, of course, something very different than arguing that certain groups in society, pharmaceutical companies, etc., are pursuing certain medications and suppressing others, and that there's a power battle between them. So it also disregards the contents of these conspiracy theories. Now, and I argue that actually it is therefore very much needed to have more empirical qualitative research that is able to differentiate between these varieties of conspiracy theories, only in order to understand where they come from, what sort of concerns they are fueled by, and also to differentiate between the dangers that they might have for public health or for the democratic societies that we live in. So the question of how and why official truths are distrusted, I think, is very important, and I think this is one of the things that we've been talking about here in the last 2 days. So to give a little example of what my research is about, this is the book that came out of my PhD dissertation, in which I pursue an ethnographic approach to study the conspiracy theory communities or worlds that are out there. And in my approach, I take an agnostic stance on the truth and also a moral, value-neutral position. Since what you see a lot on conspiracy theory research starts from the assumption that these theories are not true, irrational, and dangerous. So there's a lot of epistemic and moral judgment towards conspiracy theories before even starting the research. And I think this is not a very productive strategy to take if you want to understand where these conspiracy theories come from and what these people do and why. So in my approach, I take central the idea of meaning above truth. So what do these theories mean for the people that are involved with them? I also emphasize diversity over the uniformity. So the difficulty of speaking about conspiracy theories as a coherent category of social life. Instead, I argue that it is important to differentiate between the different kinds of conspiracy theories that we have. And the third dimension is that I emphasize context. So what you see a lot in conspiracy theory research is that they focus very much on the theories themselves and argue that because of that they are untrue or they're dangerous, etc. But they don't look at the broader context in which these theories circulate. So the role, for example, platforms and how social media platforms maybe helping or suppressing certain conspiracy theories, how media frames conspiracy theories, how governments push for certain misinformation or disinformation campaigns, and how that all relates together. So I think it's important to look at the broader context above the very narrow focus on the theories themselves. And just to give an example of all the different conspiracy subcultures that are out there, if you look at the top left, there is the anti-vax movement, which is a movement that is very interesting in a way because it's much populated by quite highly educated urban hipsters, perhaps, that have a certain ideology of or a certain idea of health as well that runs counter to modern medical perspectives, and they lean a lot on alternative or Eastern holistic medicine. They also stimulate different kinds of epistemologies, so they value very much ideas of emotions, feelings, experiences, testimonies, social relations. And these are markedly different if you look at, for example, the 9/11 Truth movement in the middle, where you see more arguments that are made through an epistemology of facts, of experiments, of calculations, of visualizations. And these are, again, very different from, for example, QAnon followers that have a heuristic of revelation. So of decoding, of redemption, and you see that there's a lot of narratives of coming apocalypse and how that motivates people to come together and to work towards a future after the whole world comes down. This is also a motivation for these people to pursue in these ideas. So you see very different kinds of epistemologies, different kinds of arguments that are being made, and these indicate the fact that these communities are very different. Now, if you look at the commonalities between them, is that following my research, you see that there's a lot of distrust towards the argument of scientific or other established actors about their objectivity of the media, for example, but also of science and how they're connected to all kinds of elites, how media companies are in the hands of, like we have maybe 500 in the US context, 500 news outlets, but how they're all owned by 3 or 4 major companies, or how scientific experts are actually part of all kinds of corporations. So they distrust the objectivity and the independence with which experts in fields of media or science legitimize their position. But also there is a lot of arguments about the social distance between experts and laymen. So a lot of these conspiracy theorists feel that they are being excluded, marginalized, and maybe mocked also for not having the right kinds of expertise, and their own ideas about certain truths and their own learning curves and their own research practices into certain topics are being discarded because they're not part of the institutional establishment. So you see a lot of distrust towards the official narrative because people feel not represented by the experts, and they embody this social distance between them. And a third indication of the distrust towards these experts is that maybe relates again to the consensus that we also heard Matt spoke about. The fact that actually there is a very strong consensus in media or in science about a certain topic. So one narrative that is being pushed as the truth also gives rise to a lot of distrust from these people, because they feel that that it's actually more logical that there are a diversity of opinions and expertises, and these should be weighed next to each other. So the moment there is a consensus, actually gives rise to distrust. Now, following all these different conspiracy theories, I highlight actually 3 or 2 central concerns, and that you see is the fact that the institutions, the mainstream institutions of society, so science, politics, the state, media, etc., are contested because they are regarded as part of a broader elite, and therefore also their knowledge is being compromised. So the central question that they pursue is how can we trust knowledge and truth to be reliable in the world? Coming back to the corona pandemic and the conspiracy theories around it, it was very interesting to see how the dominance of public health authorities was also impetus for the distrust towards what was going on during the corona crisis, and especially the fact that these public health authorities are dominated in this, their reliance on experts. There were mostly virologists, epidemiologists, so their dominance in scientific or in public and policy debates were very much distrusted because they felt like there's many other experts that need to be part of these committees. And the fact that, for example, in Holland, the public health committee that is advising the government was undisclosed to the public. So we don't know who is actually in this advisory committee and what kind of expertises are there and what kind of experts are actually in it. Yet the government legitimizes their action by saying we follow the advice of the scientific experts that are part of our outbreak team, as it's called. A second feature that was causing a lot of distrust was the sort of uniform mainstream media narrative that emerged after the corona crisis really hit Europe. So in the Netherlands, there was a lot of concordance in the way mainstream media were reporting on the crisis. And this also gave rise to a lot of distrust because people were feeling like, hey, how come are all these newspapers, news shows continuously arguing for the same sort of points? How come the media narrative is so uniform? This raises suspicion. A third reason why the corona pandemic was seen with such vigilance was the sort of misfit that people felt between the mitigation measures taken and the actual situation. So people were comparing the amounts of hospitalizations or deaths in contrast to, for example, 2 years ago when also we had a quite strong influenza season. And they were comparing these numbers and they were quite similar. So how come now we are taking such draconic measures to curb the spread of the virus instead of a few years ago? And I think another aspect was the exclusion of alternative perspectives and actors. And here it comes in, for example, the hydroxychloroquine debate, that there were many actors that were arguing for certain different medications or research to be done, and they were very quickly excluded by the main authorities, medical authorities, and they were censored to actually pursue such research. So this also gave rise to a lot of suspicion of why that is actually happening. Now, it is often said that conspiracy theories then sort of turn their back on mainstream authorities and they go away and they are not engaging with mainstream society anymore. But what I see also following my research is that actually a lot of conspiracy theorists are actively engaging to revitalize these institutions. So they are discontent with, for example, the way the media was reporting on the crisis and the exclusion of certain experts in these media channels gave rise to all kinds of alternative media channels. So we have, for example, all kinds of Twitter activism where people were pushing certain actors that were not being heard in the mainstream media. I also met a lot of people who were starting their own YouTube channels and were having interviews with experts that were not being heard in the mainstream media. And these range from ordinary people that having discontents with how the coronavirus pandemic was handled, but also more credentialed experts, such as the woman you see on the bottom left. She is a professor at Erasmus University, so a very established university, and still she couldn't really make her points in the mainstream media, and she was then interviewed by these people. So I think I'm already reaching the end of my talk. Let me go back. So you can get my dissertation open access for free, and I'm very curious to hear questions and comments. Let me see how I get this back.
Thank you, Jaron. So questions? I see Matt.
Okay, thanks, Jaron. Really enjoyed that. One thing I'm curious about is it sounded like you were categorizing conspiracy theories much more broadly than I would usually. So, you're the expert on this. I'd like to hear more about why that's the case. Or maybe I just misunderstood. So if you take the example of the professor that you had a picture of, who's been interviewed on a YouTube channel, at the end there, she's an example of someone who is, you might say, on the wrong side of the mainstream, non-mainstream divide, but presumably is not an example of a conspiracy theorist. There's a bunch of other examples you could point to. So I suppose maybe my question is, how would you distinguish, how would you make the distinction between conspiracy theorists and others who are not part of mainstream scientific authority?
Yeah, I think this is a very good question that comes down to the definition of what are conspiracy theories and conspiracy theorists. And you see here a very difficulty of very neatly circumscribing what is a conspiracy theorist, if only because the whole label itself is a sort of a rhetorical strategy to exclude certain voices from public debate. So you could have a very narrow substantive definition, and that would be something in the way of somebody who argues, who points to the secret actions of a group behind the scenes. But in my research, I take a more sociological definition, and I follow what actors and ideas are being labeled as conspiracy theories. So to have a more sociological definition, and there you see that I was following the actors and the ideas that were being framed in mainstream media, etc., as conspiracy theories. So the fact that this woman was actually a university professor, but yet excluded from mainstream narratives, from mainstream media channels, and that she was taken up by conspiracy theory media, is a sign of, becomes part of the conspiracy world in that way, even though her items or her arguments may not be only this very strict conspiracy theory narrative. And this is, I think, an ongoing difficulty to follow sort of what actually is a conspiracy theory and what is actually being labeled as such, and the difference between the two.
Okay, thank you. That's worrying, but thank you.
Yeah. So I see Jacopo Domenicucci with a raised hand. Jacopo? We can't hear you.
Maybe it was raised from the discussion before. Probably continue with Maria, and then later can ask him again.
And Maria?
Thank you. Thank you very much for this paper. This is Maria Bagramian. I'm the overall coordinator of this project. And you might be interested to know that when we put together this project and applied for it about a year and a half ago, I never mentioned the term conspiracy theory. And now I know that this is really central to our thinking about expertise. So it's your contribution is very welcome. I have one question and a couple of little comments, but I'll just ask the question, and then if there was more time, I might make the comments. The question I have is that in the standard literature on expertise, Elizabeth Anderson, for instance, and others, it's assumed that disagreement among experts leads to lack of trust. You are basically claiming the opposite. You were claiming that, at least in the case of COVID-19, if I understood you correctly, the unity through which experts had expressed their views was one of the factors that led to a conspiratorial framework and therefore lack of trust. So you are making a claim that's very much against the consensus on how to build up trust in experts. Could you comment on that, please?
Yeah. I think this is a very good question and also a very difficult one, because on the one hand, I agree that with the sort of standard view, the disagreement amongst experts leads people to distrust, and you see that as well now. So I think both are true. That you also see very much now, indeed in the Corona crisis, the fact that there was such a strong consensus led people actually very much to think that something else is going on. How can there be such a concordance in ideas about the situation, and why are there no alternatives? People have this idea of science as well as a battle between different voices that are being played out, and I think, yeah. So I think both can be true, and it depends on different situations when the consensus actually leads to distrust, and when the dissensus between scientists may also, I'm not sure if it leads to distrust, but you see it more that leads to sort of indecisiveness about what to follow and what experts to follow, and that the scientists are also not sure about it, so why should we even listen to them? So I think it's a different kind of argument that are being used in these contexts. So again, the need to be more specific about in what contexts and situations and conditions is consensus seen as a sign of conspiracy theory and as an impetus for conspiracy theories, for distrust.
Maria, you wanted to add some comments?
Yeah. If there are no other questions, I would like to add at least one comment. Amy?
You go on.
Yeah. Okay. My recent readings on conspiracy theories have given me evidence to think that despite the distinctions you are making between different types of conspiracy theories, different categories of conspiracy theories, etc., which are very welcome, there is a common feature to conspiracy theories that if you believe in one conspiracy theory, then you believe in a whole bunch of them as well, even if they contradict each other. So you, on the one hand, you think that, for instance, Princess Diana was killed by MI5, and at the same time you believe that she's not dead at all. She's in an island hiding away. So do you have any comment on this sort of irrational feature of conspiracy theories?
Yeah, so I think the research that you refer to, and I would say I have some criticism towards that research, because this is very much done in a laboratory setting where people are given certain statements, and then they could actually agree with a certain statement or not. So then you would have an easier situation where people would agree with contradictory elements. But I do agree with you that in certain conspiracy groups, or in a lot of them, there's this concordance with like all kinds of different conspiracy theories that are believed in. But yet you could see with the different communities that different kinds of conspiracy theories are more salient, and different kinds of arguments are more important to these people, and different kinds of distrusts are more important with different groups than with others, even though they might feel that all of these conspiracy theories are true because they sort of cultured a worldview of distrust towards all kinds of elites. So I think if you dig deeper, and if you look at what people are doing in their daily lives and how their social circles look like, and also how they regard different conspiracy subcultures, you see that they are not one of the same. Even though if you ask them if they also believe in other conspiracy theories, they would agree with that. So I think it's very important to look empirically at different communities and how they also regard each other.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, Hugh, do you have a question? Or it was a raised hand?
I do. I have a question. Thanks, Jaron, for a very interesting talk. My question maybe is also perhaps in the line of Maria's question, wondering if there mustn't be something kind of more underlying, explaining why people believe in conspiracy theories. And let me formulate it in this way. So, like on your slide, explaining why people started adhering to conspiracy theories in the specific situations of the COVID pandemic. So yeah, you talked about the kind of artificial agreement between media outlets, a misfit between kind of like a lack of proportionality in the proposed measures. But I was just kind of wondering, well, you could take all of that evidence and just conclude that, yeah, there's maybe some kind of conformism and kind of perhaps not quite appropriate reaction. One doesn't need to look at that evidence and conclude that there's a conspiracy theory. Well, obviously, but so I was just kind of wondering, well, what is that extra explanatory factor that then pushes people into concluding that there is a conspiracy?
Yeah. So thank you for your question. I think it's also important to differentiate between people who are very much invested in conspiracy theories for a longer period of time already and have sort of cultivated this habitus of distrust. So they perceive new events with this cultural view of the world. So in that perspective, these people easily frame what is going on in the cultural framework they have already of distrusting experts and authorities, etc. But the interesting thing, I think, what happened during the Corona crisis, that I encountered and got in contact with a lot of people who were not at all involved in conspiracy thinking before. So they were just ordinary people having all kinds of different professions that started to think like, hey, adding all these things up, this doesn't make sense. How come is there such concordance in what is going on in the world? How come? So it would be interesting to see why these people now got into the world of conspiracy theories because of these circumstances, and why for other people they would come to a conclusion that maybe there's just sort of a media panic as well, and that there could be other arguments. But I think the combination of all these things together gave rise to people to distrust what is going on.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay, are there any other questions? I can't see Daniel, do you see any other question? No.
Yes, we have a question from Tarun. You should be able to speak now, Tarun.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. I just had a clarificatory question about something you raised at the beginning of your presentation and where it stands towards the end of your presentation. So you at the beginning raised a point about how there's a certain way of describing conspiracy theory today in the media as part of the COVID-19 pandemic as a sort of coping mechanism to allow for some sort of agency, allow for some sort of meaning making during uncertain times. And I wonder, after all the clarifications you make as your paper continues, what happens to that way of thinking about conspiracy theory? So do you read that in a certain sense? Is it still a kind of coping mechanism, or is it somehow more complicated than that, or is it not a coping mechanism? That would be my question. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I think the situation is more complex. So the explanation that is dominant of a coping mechanism is for me too simplistic and too easy, because it disregards actually the contents of these conspiracy theories. So I think while it, on a general level, it may indeed be helping people to sort of get on with like this enormous complexity and discomfort that the pandemic brought about, but it also doesn't go into the specific distrust and criticisms that people have. And I think what also led to the rise of more distrust was the fact that these arguments and these feelings were not really being taken up by the authorities or the mainstream media, and that gives the people the feeling again of that these arguments are like silenced and censored. So the same with the social media, very aggressive content moderation. also gave rise to fears of people that alternative voices, that criticism was being distrusted. So I think, indeed, it may also satisfy certain coping strategies, but the fact that the authorities are not really paying attention to the specific arguments that are being made and are even being pushed out of public debate, gives rise to even more conspiracy fears.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jaron. And so I don't see other hands raised.
You, maybe? You have your hand up?
He asked already his question.
No. Yeah, I know. I just wanted to check.
Okay. So in this case, we can close the morning session of our workshop and resume at 4 p.m. with the three last papers. And so see you later this afternoon at 4. Okay? Bye-bye. I introduce Ben Almassi, who's going to speak of goodwill, disinterest, and owing the Libs on affective indicators of expert trustworthiness. Then you have 25 minutes, and then we're going to open the discussion. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. All right, let's just go back to the beginning. All right. Good morning. It's great to be a part of this really wonderful workshop. Can everyone see my screen all right and hear me?
Yes.
Great.
Should be fine.
Okay. All right. So as many speakers have addressed already, social epistemologists have long been aware of the significant epistemic challenges of identifying trustworthy experts, whether it's fellow experts or novices doing the identifying, or whether we're trying to differentiate like genuine experts from merely putative ones, or whether we're deciding between two or more conflicting experts about who to trust or who to trust more. But whether it's because of the significant challenges involved, or because of our training and our disciplinary assumptions, or some other reason, it's notable, and I think not entirely commendable, that in practice, the challenge of identifying trustworthy experts all too often gets operationalized in ways that are still genuinely interesting and worthwhile, but which I think hollow out what's distinctive about trust, distrust, trustworthiness, and untrustworthiness. We do this in several ways. So one is to reduce trust and trustworthiness to reliance and reliability, respectively, such that what it is to trust an expert becomes just to rely on them, and a trustworthy expert just becomes a reliable one. I want to push back against this operationalization in a way that some other folks like Christina Rollin have done already in our workshop here. But even when we say that an expert is reliable, then you could ask, okay, reliable for what? And that complicates the picture a little bit further. So previously, maybe we were presumptively discussing the question of expert trustworthiness as a kind of like one-place formulation, just like expert X is trustworthy, or what we're really asking is whether expert X is reliable. But now we complicate it a little bit and think about it as a two-place relationship where X is trustworthy, but trustworthy with respect to some entrusted object. Now, the entrusted object could be any number of things. In social epistemology, we often focus pretty narrowly on propositions that we should believe as what we're entrusting to experts. Though here, we should remember that people find ourselves trusting or withholding trust in experts with regard to a diverse array of entrusted things: our health, our money, our children's or our community's well-being, and yes, also our beliefs. And today, I want to nudge us a little closer to something like Net Bayer's three-place relationship, where an expert X is trustworthy for some non-expert or fellow expert Y with respect to Z. And note in passing that X and Y can be X and Y can be individuals or groups, and sometimes X could even be a part of Y. So we don't have to presume that they're entirely distinct. Now, even as we take ourselves to be interested in expert testimony, quite often the question of trustworthy expert testimony is itself asked in terms of trustworthy expert belief. And when nested together, the epistemic challenge of identifying more or less trustworthy experts is then operationalized as finding experts with more or less reliably true beliefs. Now, this is especially neat when what it means to be an expert in some domain is itself conceived as having a sufficiently good collection of and perhaps propensity for forming reliably true beliefs in that domain, in which case a trustworthy expert just is a genuine expert. Social indicators of trustworthy expertise just are those indicators of genuine expertise. And in cases of conflict, the more trustworthy expert is the one who knows their stuff better, the one with more expertise and thus more credibility than the other. But I want to complicate this picture in ways that other folks already have as well. And I also want to point out that even veritists about expertise, people who think about expertise in terms of having true beliefs, like John Hardwig or Alvin Goldman or David Cody, even they complicate this picture at least a little bit. So consider, for example, Goldman's analysis of the novice to expert problem in his paper, Experts, Which Ones Should You Trust? Now, Goldman identifies 5 possible indicators of conflicting experts' relative trustworthiness that non-experts conceivably could look to try to figure out which one of them to trust or to trust more. And I've listed them here on the screen for us. Now, for most of these, Goldman's analysis seems to treat expert testimony and expert belief as basically interchangeable. So the evidential significance of like fellow expert agreement, number 2, gets a fascinating Bayesian explication in terms of likelihood of expert belief. And an expert's track record, that's number 5, track record of past testimony matters, but only as a window onto their track record of past beliefs on matters in their domain of expertise. And there's not really any sense here that these 2 track records meaningfully track different things. Now, when Goldman says that conflicts of interest, so number 4, can rightfully undermine expert trustworthiness, it's sometimes because what they say conflicts with what they sincerely believe, so like lying. But Goldman also says, this is the quote at the bottom of the screen, lying is not the only way that interests and biases can reduce experts' trustworthiness. Interests and biases can exert more subtle distorting influences on experts' opinions so that their opinions are less likely to be accurate, even if sincere. Now, I think that's a great point, but notice that, again, Goldman is bringing us back to cashing out an expert's trustworthiness in terms of their beliefs. Now, for his part, John Hardwig also largely operationalizes trust in experts in terms of experts' reliable belief formation, such that non-experts are rational in our epistemic dependence because expert beliefs are more likely true than those beliefs that we would form on our own. Yet Hardwig also recognizes that the relevance of experts' character matters in epistemic dependency. He puts it this way, even if the non-experts, even if the expert's truthfulness will not give the non-expert good reasons to believe. sorry, the Hardwig formulation is a little overly formal, but let me just condense the quote here. So what Hardwig is saying is that it matters that the expert is truthful. It also matters that they're competent. It furthermore matters that they are conscientious and that they engage in what he calls epistemic self-assessment. So they must not have a tendency to deceive themselves, for example. And so Hardwig's point is that the reliability of the non-expert's belief depends on the reliability of the expert's character, where truthfulness is part of the moral character of the expert, and competence, conscientious work, and epistemic self-assessment are all part of the expert's epistemic character. More recently, in her discussion of non-expert assessment of scientific expert testimony on climate change, Elizabeth Anderson identifies 3 key assessments for judgments of trustworthiness. So here's a quote from Anderson. She says, judgments of trustworthiness depend on 3 assessments. First, one must be able to judge whether testifiers are in a position to know the claims in question. Call this an assessment of expertise. Second, one must be able to judge whether testifiers are disposed to honestly communicate what they believe. Call this an assessment of honesty. Third, one must be able to judge whether testifiers are responsive to evidence, reasoning, and arguments others raise against their beliefs. Call this an assessment of epistemic responsibility. Now, one could take issue with the specifics of Goldman's list, as for example, David Cody does, or with the specifics of Anderson's list, as for example, Stephen John does. But for present purposes, what I want to point out is how these indicators all speak to expert trustworthiness in wholly non-relational or generically relational terms. So Anderson says that, quote, the mark of epistemic responsibility is responsive accountability to the community of inquirers, unquote. And I think this is a great improvement on Hardwig and Goldman, but the criteria that Anderson offers for judging epistemic responsibilities, factors that indicate an evasion of accountability, while they're worthwhile in their own right, they seem to treat the community of inquirers pretty generically. So we have evidence of an expert's trustworthiness for us only insofar as who we are and the expert's particular relationship to us. Indeed, their different relationships to differently situated us's is basically ignored, treated as irrelevant to the question at hand. Now, when we turn from social epistemology of trust and experts to the epistemology of trust generally, and especially to ethical and political work on trust, we find that a common feature across otherwise really different accounts is their need to explain what distinguishes trust from mere reliance. So many people will agree that trust is a kind of reliance, but there's something more to it. It's reliance plus. So just a couple of examples. In her recent book, How to Be Trustworthy, Catherine Hawley offers us what she calls a commitment account of trust. So to trust someone is to do something, is to believe that she has a commitment to doing it and to rely upon her to meet that commitment. Okay, really interesting. Now today I'm not going to focus so much on Hawley's account, but we could definitely talk about it, but more on Annette Byer's explicitly affective account of trust and trustworthiness, and similar, though not identical, approaches from Karen Jones, Paul Faulkner, and Russell Hardin, among others. So Jones says, for example, that trust is an attitude of optimism, that the goodwill and competence of another will extend to cover the domain of our interaction with her, together with the expectation that the trusted will be directly and favorably moved by the thought that we are counting on her. So that expectation criteria for Jones is like one way in which this is an explicitly relational and affective way of thinking about trust. Now, my intention is not to argue which of these is the best account of affective trust, or even to insist that expert trust must be understood effectively. But what I find valuable about Byers' work and other affective accounts that have been developed since then is the emphasis on relationality. So for Bayer, trustworthiness is not simply a feature of someone's moral or intellectual character. It's not a two-place relationship where X trusts Y, or where Z where X is trustworthy with respect to Z. It's a three-place relationship where X trusts Y with Z. And this draws our attention to the trusted agent and what they're entrusted with, and to whom they're trusted or trustworthy. Now, this may seem like a simple point, but I think when extended to the social epistemology of trust and experts, it complicates things in fruitful and interesting ways. So if we ask about social indicators of an expert's reliability, or specifically their reliability with regard to some particular matter, and even when we extend this to social indicators of the expert's sincerity or their epistemic responsibility, different non-expert or fellow expert evaluators may have different access to and different appreciation for such indicators. But once affective considerations are granted as relevant, then expert trustworthiness itself is relational and admits of different answers for different trusting or distrusting non-expert or fellow expert parties. So consider, for example, the work of Naomi Shaman, who spoke to us yesterday afternoon, particularly in her papers Epistemology Resuscitated, and also with Jordan and Gust, her paper The Trustworthiness of Research. Shaman attends so perceptively to how differently situated people stand in different relationality to scientists and other experts in ways that affect not just the perceptions of expert trustworthiness, but the rationality of the trust itself. To be worthy of someone's trust, it's not enough for an expert to just have good moral and epistemic character. So, talking about Hardwig's account, Shaman writes, he doesn't address the systematic trust-eroding effects of various forms of social, political, and economic injustice. Nor is it enough to be objective as traditionally understood. So Shaman offers us a different way of thinking about objectivity, understood as trustworthiness, which requires researchers not to have detachment, but far more rigorously, she says, responsible engagement, not the pretension, not the a disinterested observer, but the commitment to listening and learning from a diverse group of individuals and communities who have a stake in the research project, unquote. And it's this understanding of objectivity and trustworthiness that animates my own project here. So in the time that remains, I want to explore the relevance of affective considerations to expert trustworthiness in three respects. So first, and perhaps most straightforwardly, are scenarios in which affectively positive considerations bolster expert trustworthiness for some trusting party on some matter. Okay? Second are scenarios in which affectively neutral, which is not to say affectively empty or irrelevant, considerations either undercut experts' untrustworthiness or bolster their trustworthiness. And finally, and most peculiarly, I'm really grappling with the third one, are scenarios in which affectively negative indicators seem to actually bolster trust. And the recent phenomenon of owning the libs illustrate the last of these, and I think in what I think is a particularly arresting fashion. Okay, so first, affectively positive indicators. In her really wonderful talk yesterday, Christina Rollins said quite a bit about the importance of individual experts' goodwill for their epistemic trustworthiness. So I'll try not to be too repetitive on that, but it does bear repeating, following Annette Bayer and others, that goodwill towards the trusting person or parties and towards the entrusted goods is not just a kind of like generic positivity, but neither must it always be goodwill towards a specific already identified individual. I mean, sometimes it is, right? But for example, a medical researcher may or may not have goodwill towards members of the target population of their work without knowing precisely who they are, individually speaking. Consider also a 2010 paper by Kyle White and Robert Crease, where they discuss cases both of what they call expert tainting, but also cases of successful relationships between scientists and non-scientists. And as an illustration of the latter, White and Crease discuss what they call trusted mediator cases. For example, between an indigenous group and scientists in northern Quebec. So here's a little quote from White and Crease. They say, the Inuits, indeed, have myriad reasons to distrust Western institutions, both horizontally and, of course, vertically, considering the history of Canadian colonial oppression of Indigenous people. The Inuits' perception of scientific experts was strained by the fact that normally the environmental scientists used to arrive, collect data, and then leave without sharing what they found. In response, the Inuits designed the NRC, the Nunavut Research Center, to change that, using their financial resources to hire laboratory scientists, unquote. So as White and Crease describe it, this is a compelling case of managed distrust. So we could use Russell Hardin's formulation here of trust in terms of encapsulated interest. The indigenous groups hiring lab scientists turns the issue of encapsulated interest on its head. So Inuits and scientists from Western institutions were both genuinely interested in better understanding the effect of global climate change on this region. But given their previous experiences with institutionally affiliated scientists, it was rational for the Inuits not to trust that such scientists really cared about those interests as Inuit interests, until the NRC is built and scientists' research is directed towards those very ends. So the NRC functions as a trusted mediator because the community members who run the NRC, that employs the scientists, those community members are trustworthy to the community in both the goodwill sense and the encapsulated interest sense. Okay, we can talk a lot more about affectively positive indicators, but I want to consider what's maybe a little bit less obvious, which is what about affectively neutral indicators. Now, here I don't mean that the trusted expert is unaware of some party's trust, or that the trusting novice just has no indication one way or the other of the expert's affect, nor that one is deliberately refraining from taking expert affect into consideration. So I don't mean those things. Instead, I have in mind substantive indicators of neutrality, evidence of active disinterestedness. And you could think about this in a few different ways. So just briefly, let me use these three different versions of affective trust. So to use the Bayer formulation, we'd say that the expert in question has neither goodwill nor ill will towards any of the relevantly epistemically dependent parties, right? They're neutral in terms of their will, not just towards me, but towards all of the relevantly epistemically dependent parties. Or to use Karen Jones' language, we could say that the expert might be aware of the fact of trusting parties' dependence, but they're unmoved one way or the other by this dependence, not only for a particular party, but for any of the actual or potentially dependent parties. And last but not least, to use Russell Hardin's language, we could say that the expert encapsulates no one's interests. So their work may or may not coincide with some parties' interests, but for none of them does the expert actually care about or pursue those interests because they are those parties' interests. So the question then is whether expert affective neutrality, understood in one or more of these senses, can actually bolster an expert's trustworthiness for one or more particularly positioned, potentially trusting or distrusting parties. We can see how this might work, relatively speaking, if one such party previously took an expert to be actively allied against them, in which case learning of their committed neutrality might undercut a previous reason for distrust. Or maybe in agonistic or adversarial situations, one party previously took an expert to have goodwill towards their opponent, or to have encapsulated their opponent's interests, or to be moved favorably by recognizing the opponent's dependence on them. And in these cases, learning of an expert's committed neutrality might undercut a previously held reason to distrust. Okay, but beyond evidence against expert untrustworthiness, can experts' affective neutrality be good evidence for their trustworthiness? Now, Hardin and Jones seem not to allow for this, while Beyer is a bit more open-minded, since the trusted party could have goodwill or at least not ill will towards oneself and the objects of trust. But what does this look like in practice? When would and should we actively trust an expert, not in spite, but because of their affective neutrality towards us and other dependent parties? I'm still considering this myself, so I'd welcome any thoughts that you might have. Finally, how might affectively negative indicators bear on expert trustworthiness? Now, if the negative affect is directed against ourselves or people relevantly like us, then that would seem to be a clear indication of their untrustworthiness for us. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the expert is wrong about the matter in question, or even, all things considered, whether we should rely on them, but certainly we shouldn't trust them. Okay. But how about another scenario of expert negative affect when it's directed not against us or people who relevantly like us, but against different parties entirely? Now, maybe, and I'm seriously considering it, maybe we should say that such things are at best irrelevant to experts' trustworthiness for us. But I'm interested in those seemingly perverse situations in which someone's affective negativity towards another party makes others trust them more. And in particular, when, if ever, this kind of response is rational. Now, rational or not, the contemporary phenomenon of owning the libs seems to be a case in which one's perceived trustworthiness for one party actually stems from their active, affectively negative untrustworthiness for others. Okay, so how does this work? Well, in a piece from Rolling Stone talking about owning the libs, Eve Pazer says that owning the libs is blatant self-sabotage for dumb political reasons. And in a piece last year, Jonah Goldberg says that owning the libs can be done earnestly, which basically is when you do something symbolic or petty that infuriates liberals out of proportion to the deed. And the idea is to make them look like fools. But also it can be used ironically where the person engages in unwitting self-sabotage to make some kind of political point. So let me skip ahead for a moment. So some examples of this could be so many different ways of owning the libs. Maybe you wear a MAGA hat to a feminist book reading. An example was a guy who had his wedding catered with Papa John's Pizza, which is like a national chain here in the United States. It's not very good. He had his whole wedding catered with this pizza to make a political point. Another example was that fans of the Fox News commentator Sean Hannity, called Hannity Heads, smashed their Keurig coffee makers to boycott Keurig's opposition to Hannity's show. And of course, the irony here is, right, you destroying your coffee maker doesn't actually hurt Keurig because you've already purchased it. It's just that now you can't use the coffee maker anymore. And another example that Goldberg points to is when President Trump threatened to send Central American refugees to San Francisco, to New Orleans, to other so-called liberal sanctuary cities in the United States. And Goldberg points out that if you really are worried about immigration in the way that Trump allegedly is, then actually sending refugees into these cities doesn't actually further your political agenda. It just hurts the people in the sanctuary cities and maybe doesn't really hurt them very much. Okay, what all of these examples have in common, what makes them all owning the libs, is that by their nature, they don't really accomplish anything for you or yourself or your side. And oftentimes, they don't even really hurt your opponent in any real way. They may actually hurt you more. But the petty ridiculousness of it all sends this message. It signals to your liberal opponents that you don't wish them well, that they shouldn't trust you and you wouldn't want them to. Okay. Now, what's sort of fascinating about this?
We're a bit over time.
What's that?
We are a bit over time. But...
Okay, thank you. I'm almost done, so I appreciate that. So what's fascinating about this is whether indicating that liberals ought not trust you somehow also signals that people on your side should trust you. Now, in some ways, this is just the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so the question is whether that's ever rational or whether this is just a fallacy. In my country, at least, it's not difficult to find politicians and political authorities with considerable power who do engage in owning the libs behavior to signal their trustworthiness to their base of supporters. But it's not so easy to find even plausible imaginary scenarios where experts, people with genuine or at least perceived epistemic authority, do this. So I've tried to identify some cases where people who are plausibly identified as experts, not just political leaders, but leaders who have some kind of epistemic authority, whether it's on matters of public health, whether it's on matters of like religious dogma, whether it might be in science, where similar kinds of behaviors are engaged in. And I think it is harder to find. So tentatively, I think I'm skeptical about whether owning the libs behavior or affectively negative indicators of trustworthiness more generally, I'm skeptical about whether they have a place in the social epistemology of trust in experts. Maybe social epistemology of trust in other groups, but it's hard to see it working for experts. But this is the part of my project that's still in development, and I would definitely welcome any feedback that you might have. Okay, well, if I had managed my time a bit better, I was going to talk about why you might not want to attend to affective indicators, and we can talk about that in the Q&A, but I think this is probably a good time to bring it to a close and see what people have to say. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben. We are a little bit over time, but given that Laura didn't show up for the moment, we can be more generous with speaker's time. And so I'll open the discussion. Any questions? Just raise your hand through the little...
We have a hand from Ben. From Matt, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Ben talking.
Yes.
Sorry for that.
Thanks a lot, Ben. I'm really interested in this. I actually want to ask one of the questions that was in your last slide that you didn't get a chance to talk about. And I don't know if we can bring that slide back up, but as I recall, it was the second question about the potential problems for translating affective indicators from intimate relations of trust and trustworthiness to particularly when experts play a role in the public sphere. My worry is that there's a kind of folk psychological mind reading that would be necessary in order to make these judgments about the affects that perhaps is not always available for trusted experts. So I wondered if you could just address that a little bit more.
Yes, thank you so much. That's a great question, and I think in part for me, I'm trying to figure out where affect would fit into the epistemic process. So are these affective indicators of trustworthiness, or maybe I should say instead that we have these various social indicators of affective trustworthiness? So if it's a former, if the affect is the indicator, then you might wonder, like, how do I really get at the affect? Do I really have access to that? So maybe instead I should be thinking about it in terms of other things being indicative of affective trustworthiness. Now the challenge is still there, but at least you can meet the challenge head on, which is like, what are the kinds of things that give us good indication of the expert's affect? So that's not a complete answer to your question, but where the affect fits into the chain of epistemic dependency might give us some clarity in answering your challenge.
Okay, thank you.
I see a hand raised by Maria.
Yeah.
Hi, Ben. So good to see you here. You may be aware that this affective element of trust is really one of the core hypotheses that our project is testing, and your own work as well as Karen Jones and all the various people you mentioned have been influential in forming this hypothesis. Now, in the next phase of the project, we want to look at this empirically. I mean, this is right now we are in the philosophical phase of the project, and that's where the difficulties start in how to test the hypothesis. You just, right at the end of your presentation, you were warning us against taking the affective elements into consideration. Could you tell us why?
Oh, the part that I skipped over as to why someone might not want to do this? Well, there might be different reasons. One might be that you just reject an affective account of trust, generally speaking. So maybe you want to go with a straight reliability account, but maybe not. Maybe you like something like Catherine Holly's commitment account. So you just wouldn't think about trust affectively at all. Second reason why you might not want to do this is a bit like what Matt was talking about, which is maybe you think affective trust is relevant, but only for like intimate or interpersonal relationships, and you don't think it's relevant to expert, non-expert trust relationships. I don't think that's right for a lot of the reasons that Christina Rollin was talking about in her presentation yesterday, or in some of the ways that that Karen Frost Arnold talks about in her paper on moral trust and scientific collaboration, which is like trust and a rich affective sense of trust is still relevant there. And then the third reason why you might not want to take affective indicators into consideration, and this might be more relevant to your project, is maybe you think the challenge is hard enough already to investigate without having to even think about affect, and so it just makes things harder. And I would want to say that it definitely makes things more complicated, but taking more factors into consideration isn't necessarily going to make the problem just harder. So maybe if you have to attend not just to competence, but also to affective indicators, maybe that makes it harder to find like genuinely trustworthy experts, but maybe it makes it easier to find experts who are untrustworthy in one respect or more.
Thanks. Can I ask one more question, Gloria?
Sure.
Very quickly. So, yes, those are all very relevant points, and I think we can overcome them, including even the difficult question of whether trust applies only to intimate, or affect applies only to intimate trusted relations or to experts as well. But my worry, and this is something that I mentioned to Christina yesterday as well, is whether it is true that people, at least in connection with experts, take affect into account. I mean, this is a new question for me and some of my colleagues in the project, whether the empirical data is going to show that the philosophically nice hypothesis that you like and I like and many others among us, that's not actually backed by how people assess expertise, because they prefer to the safer route of objectivity in some sense rather than bringing in affect that can be a two-edged sword.
Well, I agree that is a really important empirical question. It's not something we can presume the answer to, and I'm really glad that your team is going to move into that stage of your project. I guess I would say it's also an equally good empirical question as to whether non-experts really do just want something that's like allegedly objective and neutral. We may sort of presume that they would like that, but I don't know that that's obvious either, that people might attend to affective considerations as much or even more of experts as they do to the experts' competence and reliability. Mm-hmm. I'm certainly not in a position to claim that, but I think those are both empirical questions that have to be asked.
Maybe we can have this conversation over the next few months with you, with Bob Duffy and his team in KCL, who are going to do the empirical study of this, because I think it'd be very helpful to us if we can just talk about this with you.
So great. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much.
I see a hand raised by Naomi. So, Naomi.
Hi, thank you, Ben, for this really challenging set of questions you've put before us. I'm wondering whether, with respect to sort of the final set of issues, whether this is a relevantly interesting thing to be bringing into the conversation, namely biting the hand that feeds you. So I'm thinking it's a little bit, you had this sort of thing you didn't really get to discuss of a scientist announcing their own corporately funded research, but I'm thinking more generally of experts who have a publicly visible, significant track record of making it clear that the results that they're talking at go against the interests of those who are funding their research. And whether that sort of blatant, I'm coming up with things and putting stuff out there that goes against the interests of those who are funding me, whether that has or more interestingly, rationally ought to have an effect on their trustworthiness.
Yeah. Yes, I really want to investigate that. And I feel like perhaps most straightforwardly, you could see how doing that successfully would undercut other parties' reasons to distrust. If you sort of show that you're not in the pocket of those who have funded you. But I'm also interested in if there's ever like a rational scenario in which doing that not only undercuts reasons to distrust, but somehow provides active reasons to trust the person.
Yeah, I think I was getting at the possibility that it might, and certainly that somebody might try to do that. That is, might try to make themselves appear trustworthy by going on very publicly and loudly about their biting the hand that feeds them.
Naomi, do you just have in mind any like examples of a person doing that or a group doing that?
No, I just made it up. Sorry.
Okay, I have a question by Michael Croce.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Ben. So just a quick follow-up to what Maria was saying before. I was wondering whether, perhaps I got lost at some point, but I was wondering whether the positive affective indicators, could it be the case that lack, explicit or like a blatant lack of these indicators can tell us something about why an expert is untrustworthy, but in the positive case, the work of these factors as indicators or reasons, extra reasons to trust, should we think of them as epistemic reasons? So I'm a little bit torn over this. Do they help? Do they provide us with further epistemic reasons, or should we consider them like practical reasons or some sort of could it be just that we have to expand the notion of trustworthiness to make room for something more besides epistemic considerations?
Yes, thank you, Michael. So there's sort of two things there. Can the very clear and maybe even deliberate lack of positive indicators, can that actually itself be evidence against an expert's trustworthiness? And I think that's definitely worth considering. When I was laying this out for myself, I realized that the Venn diagram of these categories could get really, really large. So for today, I just wanted to focus on how the positive, neutral, and negative indicators could each potentially be evidence for trustworthiness, or at least evidence against this untrustworthiness. But I think the opposite is true as well, which is that each of these indicators could also speak to untrustworthiness. And so I'm interested in exploring that in more detail. But then you had asked, should we think of these as epistemic reasons or maybe just practical reasons? And I take it that in many of the cases we're talking about, these are going to affect what we believe, what we take ourselves to know. So I think they're going to be epistemic in that sense. Now, if you want to restrict epistemic reasons narrowly to things that make it more likely that the proposition in question is true, if you want to have a really narrow reading of what an epistemic reason is, then I'm not so sure whether these will or will not count as epistemic reasons. So understood.
Can I quickly follow up?
Yes, and then
super quickly, just to mention, I see your point. I'm not sure how to address it. I just see it. And one thing that might be helpful, perhaps it's something that you already know very well, and I'm not saying nothing new to you, is that this has a quite nice connection with what Sandy Goldberg argues on the epistemic partiality in friendship, and why he makes this distinction between epistemic reasons and practical reasons, arguing that the friendship case is a case where what we take to have as epistemic reasons, like the friend relationship, should be thought as a practical reason. Otherwise, we have huge problems in the epistemic domain. And I silence myself now. Thanks.
Thank you for that suggestion. I'm familiar with Sandy's work, but I hadn't really made the connection to this project. So thank you. I'm going to go and look back at that.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we should stop here. And Laura is still not there, so I think we should switch to Charles' presentation, which will be on watching people who watch people, culture, prestige making, and epistemic authority. So Charles, please.
Okay. Hello. Good morning here, afternoon, I gather there. I take it everybody can hear and see all right?
Yes, we can
Yes, we do.
see you, and the slide is not the first one.
Hold on. Let's see what's going on.
So there was another one with the title, but...
Is the slide with the title no showing?
No, it's a diagram with content.
Oh, golly. All right, hold on a second here. Oh, golly. I must have clicked the wrong thing here. Oh, well, shoot. I selected the wrong screen. One moment. Sorry about that.
Yes.
All right. Sorry about that. Selected the wrong screen there. So clearly I just haven't had enough coffee this morning. So thank you so much. So my talk is watching people. So culture, prestige, and epistemic authority. So I want to start off with the problem, which is that people often put their trust in sham authorities, as we've sort of talked about a bit in this conference already, or this workshop already. So cases of this, right? So President Donald Trump trusts noted conspiracy theorist Alex Jones for information on current events. Trump would often sort of parrot what it is that Alex Jones says on his conspiracy theory program InfoWars and say, "Hey, have you heard this lately?" So that's the case. Other ones, people put their trust in George Madoff for investing. Othello, of course, trusted Iago. So how should we respond to these things? Well, I think there are two intuitive responses. One is that the learner is to blame, right? The novice is to blame. That they should have done some better research, or that broadly speaking, their trust in the sham authority is the product of an epistemic vice. Another intuitive response is that it's the sham authority who is to blame, right? That they that also through either moral or epistemic vice manipulated the learner into trusting them, right? So Iago, of course, is a case of this. So I want to suggest, so I think these intuitive responses, they get something right, they get something wrong. What they get right is that sometimes we trust people, learners, novices, trust the wrong person because of the operation of some epistemic vices. But I think what these intuitive responses miss is that by focusing on that novice authority dyad, they neglect the role of context, the sociocultural context, for the operation of psychological processes for picking out authorities, right? So Gerd Gigerenzer is keen to remind us that psychological mechanisms often possess ecological validity, and so we might have a properly functioning psychological mechanism for identifying authorities, but the context could be making things wonky. So my proposal then is that one cause, or perhaps one explanation for treating sham authorities as if they were genuine, is the exercise of psychological mechanisms for identifying authorities, but in an unfriendly epistemic context. So just a quick glance at what we're going to about how this talk is going to go. It's going to talk about cultural psychological work on prestige bias, and draw some distinctions that cultural psychologists, or present some distinctions that cultural psychologists draw. Talk about some background conditions for identifying authorities with respect to a particular domain. I'll sort of flesh out my initial proposal and then suggest some remedies for the problem. So first, cultural psychology and prestige bias. So learning whom to trust is it's an important cultural adaptation, right? And it's an important cultural adaptation, right? Because we're social learners, and most recently, Joe Henrich and Francisco White's paper it has become kind of a modern classic of prestige bias. Though it's worth noting that a lot of their ideas are prefigured by Boyd and Richardson and Peters and Ceci in a way. So a necessary condition for for social or cultural learning to be advantageous is that you have to pick out the right models, right? If you don't pick out the right models, if you're following the wrong authorities, the wrong experts, well, then that's not going to be helpful for you, right? So the question is how do we do this? So one way in which we do this is to leverage the utility of to leverage social hierarchies. So the initial thought is that individuals who are at the tops of social hierarchies are potentially worth imitating. Right? So within within human communities, as opposed to our non-human primate brethren, there are two non-violent ways to rise in hierarchies. We might do it through dominance and prestige. Although dominance, there's a parallel between human dominance and rising in hierarchies and non-human primate uses of dominance to rise in hierarchies. But with dominance, folks use fear and compulsion to gain deference. So this we can contrast with prestige, right? Prestige is where folks use influence or persuasion instead to rise through the hierarchy. And Hendrick and Gil White illustrate the difference between these two methods of rising in hierarchies through the use of humor. It's just one way, but humor is relevant here because dominant individuals will often use humor to mock others in order to gain the fear, and respect of folks further down in the hierarchy. Whereas prestigious folks will often use self-deprecating humor, right, and thereby gain people's respect and are able to influence people, but without, being dominant over them. So people earn prestige when they display competence in a socially valued domain. So the socially valued part here, I think, is worth noting, because we mark folks as prestigious when they are competent, when they are good at something in a domain that is valued by a social group. So, for example, if you are part of a social group that does not value trophy hunting, for example, then somebody a newcomer to the group who boasts about what a fantastic trophy hunter they are, well, they're not going to earn prestige in that group because their competence is not in a domain that's valued by the members of that group. So this sort of points towards prestige bias, this learning mechanism of prestige bias. So prestige bias is disproportionately copying the behaviors of individuals perceived as prestigious. Put another way, humans are biased towards prestigious individuals, right? We use hues to identify prestige of individuals. And Hendrick and Gil White suggest that age is one of these hues. We're going to see that this gets a smidge complicated, but this is at least a sort of a good sort of first look at a cue for identifying prestigious individuals, right? The older folks are, the more prestigious they are believed to be. So prestige bias, then, is using these cues to discern whom to trust. So cultural psychologists distinguish between first-order and second-order cues. So first-order cues are properties of individuals that are used to identify prestige. So I mentioned before age. Other first-order cues are wealth or generosity or the pedigree of your higher education degree. And I mentioned Peters and Ceci before. They have this paper that was published in 82, in which it's just such a wonderful study. I love talking about it. In which they took papers that had been published in a peer-reviewed journal, but it wasn't blind peer review, and they changed the authors' names and the university affiliations from things like Harvard University or Oxford to Tri-County Potential for Human Excellence. And so when reviewers were looking at these papers that had already been accepted and published in this journal, why they didn't pick up on that is perhaps worrisome. But they saw the institutional affiliation, the sort of less prestigious it was, the more often reviewers would cite massive methodological errors with the paper, right? So these are right. So quick tangent there, but these are cases of first order cues. Now, second-order cues, by contrast, they're a relational property holding between learners and putatively prestigious individuals. So second-order cues are looking at to whom learners are attending to figure out who is prestigious. Now, each one of these has some advantages and some liabilities. An advantage of first-order cues is that they're less cognitively demanding than second-order cues. You don't have to track, right? Second-order cues, you have to track who people are attending to, right? You have to track multiple relationships. With first-order cues, you just have to track the one property, right? So first-order cues are advantageous in that sense. But sometimes first-order cues can be faked, right? And sometimes shifting cultural landscapes renders the cues no longer reliable in identifying prestigious individuals. So, for example, age. Age is a reliable indicator of prestige, provided that the cultural landscape is stable for long stretches of time. If these same methods that served your culture, right, if those methods that are advantageous for you and your culture are the same today as they were, hundreds of years ago, then age is a useful cue for prestige. But if those methods aren't the same, right? If those tools and techniques that served, members of your culture hundreds of years ago are outdated now, then age isn't as reliable a cue. Second-order cues tend to be more reliable in the sense that it's really hard to fake the number of people paying attention to you, right? It's hard to, traditionally, right? Social media currently sort of bracketing that situation or bracketing that case. It's often hard to fake how many sort of followers you have, how many people attend to you. Right? But the liability with second-order cues is that we have informational cascades in the sense that, or we have worry about informational cascades in the sense that if a large enough portion of the population is attending to the wrong person, then attending to a sham authority as opposed to a genuine one, then the sham authority only gets more people reinforcing that they're an authority, but they're really not. So prestige bias is a learning mechanism. So I want to distinguish prestige bias from prestige marking. So prestige marking is identifying prestigious individuals, right? And it's a part of prestige bias. But I'm more interested right now in how folks identify prestigious individuals. So we can distinguish between first-order prestige marking, which is identifying prestigious models through first-order cues like wealth and our friend King Georgia, and second-order prestige marking, which is identifying prestigious individuals by attending to those to whom other learners are attending. So we've distinguished first-order and second-order prestige marking. So now I want to discuss some of the background conditions for prestige marking. And so I suggest that there are three background conditions for identifying authorities. The first are success criteria, right, which are criteria for successful performance, right, what it means to be successful with respect to some domain. The second background condition is property identification, right, identifying those properties, those agential properties that are responsible for instances of success. Finally, causal connection, which is some kind of causal story for how those properties that are identified are responsible for successful performance. So when these conditions are transparent, we're more likely to pick out genuine authorities. But the more opaque these conditions are, the more challenging it is to identify a genuine authority, and the higher the likelihood that we'll glom onto a sham authority. So there are two questions I want to address in this regard. The first is talking about why background conditions are relevant and not just cues, and then also what it means for these things to be transparent. So the kinds of cues that individuals use to identify prestigious individuals, I take it that those are going to be identified by the relevant sciences, right? So culture. So again, cultural psychologists tell us that people attend to generosity or wealth as first-order cues when identifying authorities, right, or epistemic authorities. And whether or not those cues are reliable will depend on the track record of those cues, right? How well they show themselves to pick out genuine authorities. However, the background conditions are those conditions in virtue of which novices are able to identify usable cues at all. So, for example, having cues to pick out successful individuals, right, to pick out prestigious individuals, those cues don't do much for novices or for learners when there's no agreed upon conception of success. Right? So if what it means to be successful with respect to a particular domain isn't widely shared, then cues picking out successful individuals don't do much. What does it mean to say that that these background conditions that we want them to be transparent? Well, transparency here is a matter of it's a matter of widespread mutual agreement or recognition or understanding. So the more widespread, the greater the mutual agreement of these various background conditions on what constitutes these background conditions, the greater a chance the novice has or the learner has of attaching themselves or of picking out a genuine authority as opposed to a sham authority or an authority who's faking it. So, pulling these threads together, learners mark prestigious individuals from whom to learn, and they do this using both first-order and second-order cues. But for this talk, I'm going to focus on second-order cues and second-order prestige marking. This activity of marking takes place against a set of background conditions that are socially defined, and the transparency of those conditions is a function of their widespread acceptance. So, when we're looking at prestige marking in context, right, second-order prestige marking is done in a social context that consists of these background conditions that I've mentioned, as well as the learners or the novices' social network. So, how did these things go wrong, right? How does picking out an authority go wrong? Well, if so far I'm not wildly off, there are two ways in which they can go wrong, right? One way is with respect to the background conditions, and the other way is with respect to the learner's network. So the way in which we can have failure in these background conditions is that our criteria for success aren't widely shared, or the criteria for success are improperly transferred between or among domains, that those relevant properties for success aren't widely shared or understood, and that the causal connection between the properties and the successful performances, that causal connection is likewise not widely shared or widely understood. Excuse me. So an example of this, an example of failure in the background conditions, I think is happening with right here in the U.S. with our own President Trump. So a number of political pundits back in 2016 argued that Trump's business sense, right, his purported business acumen, and the fact that he had no experience whatsoever inside of government, some pundits argued that this is what made him an excellent candidate. Other pundits argued that that's exactly what made him unqualified for the job. So in this case, we have failure in terms of what it means to be a successful president, right, or a successful politician, or an effective politician. So one conception of an effective politician might be that, or a successful politician is one that has a track record of putting forward policies that are helpful, that make people's lives better, that they have lots of experience in, developing policy. So that's one conception of a successful politician. Another conception of a successful politician is one who runs the country like they would their business, right? Where they didn't want to, get maximum output from their employees for minimum input, being careful to balance their budgets and their costs and expenses. So a lack of agreement in what it is to be, or a lack of mutual agreement for what it is to be a successful politician, I think, is a failure in one of these background conditions. And so that enables sham authorities to then sort of get picked out as genuine authorities. Now, another way in which we can have failure, right? Another way in which there's in which sham authorities might get picked out is when we have a failure in the learner's social network. So, as I mentioned before, it's entirely possible that within a particular social network, a number of members within the learner's social network have picked out the wrong kind of authority, have picked out a sham authority as opposed to a genuine one. And so when the learner checks with members of their social network for whom is prestigious, then the learner ends up picking out a sham authority, ends up picking up the wrong kind of authority, because other members of their network have all zeroed in on that one individual as a genuine authority, but really they're not, right? They're a mere sham authority. So I think a case of this is with Bernie Madoff, right? The Ponzi schemer. So Bernie Madoff managed to swindle millions of dollars from unsuspecting investors. How did this happen? Well, Madoff consistently reported that his investments consistently returned profits, right? So clients were perhaps willfully unaware that investors should lose money on occasion, right? So investors can expect to gain money, right? Can expect to earn money in the long run, right, through their investments. But on occasion, right, there should be, downturns or extended downturns. And so this, I submit, is a case of failure in the success criteria background condition, right? Clients didn't have a shared understanding with the broader financial community of what it means to be successful, right? Successful is winning, is picking out winning investments more often than losing investments. But nonetheless, even when you're consistently picking out winning investments, you should expect to lose sometimes. Next, when it comes to the properties of Madoff, that are responsible for his success, that there was a talent, quote unquote, for picking out investments, right? But it was unclear, right? In virtue of what Madoff was able to pick out these winning investments, that wasn't clear, but it purportedly worked. Well, he said it worked. Finally, his talent, right, whatever that should be, was thought of as responsible for his apparent success. But again, whatever sort of magic he had for, right, quote unquote magic for picking out investments, it was clear that was sort of faked, right? And so there couldn't be this story told about how his supposed talent was responsible for his supposed success. And finally, Madoff was a member of the financial sector for decades, right? He was so his professional network was populated by respected financiers and investors. And so when folks connected to those, right? So when investors connected to those financiers who were connected to Madoff, when those investors looked to their social networks, they saw people they trusted trusting Madoff. So Madoff, I submit, is a case of where people, where we have failure in these conditions for picking out genuine authorities. So to recap, second-order prestige marking goes awry when success in a domain is ill-defined or ill-understood, when there's a range of potential properties that explain the success, when there's some post hoc story that can be told connecting those identified properties to the success, and when a sufficiently large segment of the population ends up picking out the wrong person. So this is worrisome. So what are some potential remedies? Right? How might we avoid marking shams in the future? So one is perhaps that time is on our side, right? That the truth will out eventually, right? I mean, after all, we know that Madoff was one of these sham authorities because his scheme was eventually uncovered during the 2008 financial crisis. And so frauds can't go on forever. And so perhaps one strategy is to simply wait it out. However, this might be a plausible tactic for token sham authorities, but it's not a useful strategy in general because when one sham is exposed, others can move in. Right? Right? When some shams are identified, right? We have a new cultural landscape, and so people, right? So it's just a matter of new schemers adapting to this changed cultural landscape. Perhaps, though, we could reform hostile or unfriendly epistemic contexts. Excuse me. So, in principle, cultures have systems set up to disseminate information that can help weed out the fraud experts, right? So, we have, formal educational institutions, right? We have culturally significant mentorship relationships, and so perhaps we can leverage those existing systems in order to come up with greater agreement about what it is to be successful or the responsible or within a domain, or those properties that enable success within those domains and the various background conditions that I talked about. The problem, though, is that these systems have to be agile enough to respond to adaptations by these various sham authorities. And large institutions are notoriously bad at adapting to changing cultural landscapes. In the U.S., for example, our national education system, actually there actually is no national education system. Educational decisions are made at the level of states, and so you have 50 independent entities trying to come up with all devising their own educational standards, and so trying to coordinate all 50 of those is a fool's errand. So this is possible, right, that we could reform our formal educational institutions in order to prevent people marking sham authorities, but I'm sort of skeptical that this is a feasible solution because of the sort of the details involved with actually pulling it off. So, to recap, our initial problem that is people putting their trust in sham authorities. The proposed diagnosis that I offered is that prestige marking capacities are deployed in epistemically unfriendly environments, and those epistemically environments are those in which the background conditions aren't transparent. In the case of second-order prestige marking, our epistemic networks can lead novices astray. But because the problems are with cultural information, remedies are required at the scale of cultures and not individuals, and so the prospects for avoiding or of remediating these problems in the future are going to require a lot of coordination. And thank you very much. I appreciate the time and the opportunity to share this with you.
Thank you, Charles. So I think we have some time for discussion, also because our third speaker of the afternoon session didn't show up. So we can concentrate the discussion on Charles' paper, and also if you want to raise some questions about the previous presentations, I think we have the time, because we have time until 6. So any questions? I see some raised hands, but I think that they are from the previous. I have a question. I raised my hand. Okay. So thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. And I wonder how informational cascades and gossip can also play a role in your account. I mean, many people trust prestigious people, not directly, but I mean, they trust what prestigious people trust. So there is a chain that is more complex, and I wonder whether I mean, how would you react to this? I mean, and how does it fit into your account?
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful. I hadn't, I hadn't thought about gossip, but I really appreciate it. So the way we fit into the account is something like, it might be that individuals, so that when we're looking at members of our social networks, it's not just people that we sort of know personally or that with whom we might be associates or sort of casual friends or whatever. We might also look at other prestigious people, right? So I guess we'd have to, in this sense, our social network, we could read that kind of broadly as including other folks, right? So like other prestigious folks, right? So for example, to go back to my Alex Jones, Donald Trump case, right? It could be that I trust Donald Trump to be an effective purveyor of reliable information, right? And so because Trump trusts Jones, right, I thereby come to trust Jones too, right?
Yeah, that's my idea.
Yeah. No, that's really cool, and I really like the idea. I suppose the way I'd want to modify it is to say that within our social networks, there are individuals whose opinions have greater weight for us, right? And so because I regard, right, and that greater weight might just be a function of how prestigious we regard them, right? So if I regard Donald Trump as really prestigious, then the fact that he esteems Alex Jones raises Alex Jones in my estimation.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, no, that's great. I want to include that. So thank you very much for the suggestion.
Thank you. Any other questions about Charles' paper?
I think there is a hand from Daniel Andler.
Daniel?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
But you can't see me. I was shocked throughout this conference that we don't see people asking questions, but I think that's architectural, right? You see me. Okay.
Yeah, it is. We can see only the panelists.
Okay.
The attendees. I'm sorry.
So I can make you a panelist if you want to show something.
No. It's not indispensable. For me, it's not that important. I was just wondering. Anyway, so thank you, Charles, for this very challenging talk. I have a very vague question, which is, you rightly emphasized the role of context, and I was wondering whether one might extend the context to such a degree that it would include the mood, the zeitgeist, the mood of the time. And so I was wondering whether that could be done and whether there's any sort of chance of getting some empirical evidence that there are periods where somehow the environment is toxic, so to speak, and of course we think of today, and periods when it's less toxic, maybe 20 years ago, 50 years ago, or that might be an illusion. Anyway, that's my general sort of question.
Well, thank you, Daniel. I really appreciate that. So in with respect to whether it's possible to sort of capture it, or like sort of I guess sort of empirically capture this notion of zeitgeist. Mm-hmm. Yes, there are a lot of interesting ways to do this. One that I've right. So one set of tools from cultural psychologists is to look at just sort of cultural objects that we might take for granted. So one of my colleagues here, with whom I'm grateful and fortunate to do a lot of work, is from Japan. And one of the things he remarked to me is that he was telling me on Japanese currency. I haven't verified this for myself, but I'm taking his word for it. On Japanese currency, there are cultural icons who are artists, writers, and like that, sort of those sorts of cultural icons. While on American currency, we have our presidents, right? And so he says that this is one reflection of, or one instance of the difference between American culture and Japanese culture, right? American culture elevates former political leaders to, insofar as they put them on currency, whereas in Japanese culture, what gets elevated aren't the political leaders, but contributors to Japanese culture. There are other ones too. There's a great study looking at smiles of faces in children's books. So Taiwanese children's books, they tend to have, right, when the kids are smiling, the smiles take up a smaller proportion of their face relative to popular American kids' books. And cultural psychologists argue that this is related to sort of the individualist and collectivist orientations of culture. One that I've been thinking a lot about lately is a project looking at manifestos of political parties from first world countries, or sort of industrialized countries around the world, and looking at sort of comparing them on sort of more liberal or more conservative scales, right? And so the one for the U.S., back in, right, so like the Conservative Party in America was a lot more liberal back in the 40s and 50s than it is now, right? And so the researchers here map the relative political the relative liberality or conservativeness of these parties by looking at past manifestos, looking at keywords. So there are a lot of tools that cultural psychologists and anthropologists have available to them to sort of measure the zeitgeist, right? Now, incorporating that into my work, I would, yes, I very much want to include this in the notion of context. I still have, I want to do some more thinking about just how to do it, but it strikes me that it's absolutely relevant. So if we're, I mean, as Ben talked about, and as you've mentioned, right, we have sort of this toxic, at least in the U.S., we have a very toxic political atmosphere where, representatives from each of the major parties is perfectly willing to denigrate members of the other party, although I would suggest it probably happens more in one direction than in the other. But this is certainly relevant to the broader cultural context in which we pick out authorities. And so I guess the short answer is yes, I want to include sort of what you're describing as sort of zeitgeist relevant information. It's just I'm still sort of thinking through how exactly to incorporate it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I think Hugh has a question, is it?
That's right. I have a question. As panelists, I can put on my video. Thanks. Hello, Charles. Thank you very much for interesting and very engaging presentation. I'm quite interested in this material myself. And so I kind of understood your talk as so people put trust in the sham authorities, and the kind of this proposed solution was to look at these background conditions to change them. So I was kind of wanted to challenge you a little bit there. So I was wondering if that gets to the core of the problem, because sham authorities, con men have always been around. It's not a new phenomenon, and kind of what's their logic or methodology? They prey on the needy, so they identify a need in often a vulnerable person, or in a sense, I guess everybody is vulnerable. That's like what talented con men do. They find the chink in the armor of a person's psychology, their dreams or irrealistic dreams, and they manipulate that. So the confidence trick. They make them believe and trust this person that they can fulfill those needs. And of course, you fill in the details how Trump, of course, is a master at that. But so it seems to kind of go deeper, because that suggests then also that, if it happens on a wide societal scale, that it does reflect something on a large section of the population as somehow being needy or vulnerable in this kind of sense, not further defined, of course, that they're desperate and, in a sense, with the lack of autonomy. And so here I want to kind of connect to how, I think what you're sketching here is the real kind of weakness in social epistemology, the dynamics, of course, that can be hijacked, these conformist and prestige heuristics, these cascades, and with suboptimal outcomes. But that's, of course, why an important part of epistemology is based on the concept of autonomy and not merely trust, that you evaluate the beliefs for yourself. And so, and that's kind of another way of looking at the desperate or the needy, that they don't have that type of epistemic autonomy. So, so I guess maybe one way to wrap it up would be that it's not really the background conditions only, because that's kind of an inevitable feature of the dynamics you're describing. What's kind of unique about, let's say, present context is the lack of autonomy or a large degree of vulnerability of large parts of the population.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. So if I understand you rightly, the culprits for why people end up trusting sham authorities is more immediately sort of, would you say, is more immediately failures to exercise epistemic autonomy, or something along those lines?
Yes.
Okay. Just want to make sure I understand you properly. So I guess I really feel your point about con men preying on needy people, right? That seems absolutely right. It is right. So I guess I'd want to sort of dig deeper into this notion of epistemic autonomy, right? Whether our conception of epistemic autonomy, if we can define that independently of the kinds of social or cultural dynamics that I'm describing here, and I'm not totally confident that we can, right? If we're conceiving of autonomy as like sort of a like the Cartesian mind that's independent from the this messy, ugly world around us, then perhaps we could say that the responsibility or the causes for people paying attention to sham authorities when they should be directing their attention elsewhere, then perhaps perhaps the individual would be most responsible there. But I'm not confident that we ought to conceive of epistemic autonomy in that way, because the ways in which we process information, the way that we work through evidence is often sensitive to context, right? Especially cultural context. There's the paper by Nisbet and oh my gosh, I can't remember its co-authors. But and I'm kind of embarrassed because it's a classic of cultural psychology, showing that there are systematic differences between the way that Westerners process information and East Asians process information. And so I take this as evidence suggesting that the ways in which we work our way through evidence, that the ways in which we work our way through evidence are going to be bound to culture, right? Sort of bound to context. And so I think our conception of epistemic autonomy is going to need to take that into account. So granted that there's variability at the individual level, right? Individual neediness might play does play an interesting role, but I don't know if it can account. But I don't know if it's sort of the sole the sole mechanism there to absolve us from considering context. If that, I think, makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It's helpful. Food for thought.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
Maria, I think.
Yeah. So this is a question for both the speaker and Hugh as well. Given the context in which these discussions were taking place, namely trust in experts, does it make even sense to talk about, to prioritize epistemic autonomy? Because trust in experts is standardly through process of learning from experts and testimony. So the question is not so much developing any sort of autonomy, but more the one of developing the right form of epistemic dependence. So I just wanted to see if that's the variable that we need to be focusing on rather than autonomy in this particular context when we are looking at prestige of the experts.
So focusing not necessarily on autonomy, but on forming the right kinds of relationships?
So the right sort of relationship of dependence, exactly the opposite of, because we are learning through testimony in this context when we're learning from experts and trusting experts. So it is one of dependence necessarily.
Charles, could I chime in?
Yeah, please.
I think I would absolutely agree if we think about epistemic autonomy strictly in terms of epistemic independence, and a lot of times people have, but we could develop a more relational sense of epistemic autonomy. And then I think if we do, it would make sense to think about the place of a more relational kind of epistemic autonomy that acknowledges and maybe even celebrates the epistemic dependence that was it Maria, the previous speaker was just saying.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps I could add something. So I think it's kind of seems to be one of the core questions, really. Trust and autonomy seem to be mirror concepts, really, of each other. Autonomy, of course, being the concept that has received most attention in modern philosophy. And I think Charles was right that if you analyze forms of epistemic autonomy, you will find some forms of relationality under the surface. Sometimes they'll be forgotten, and we think ourselves to be, self-sufficient. But we do rely on perhaps certain authorities, perhaps the more reliable authorities, as you suggest, Maria. But I would nonetheless like to say that, epistemic autonomy does seem to be picking out something. It doesn't necessarily correspond to this ideal type of, the Cartesian mind, surveying all the information in the world and coming to a conclusion. But there does seem to be something like, thinking for yourself, to put it in a very Enlightenment sense, but to, reason critically, to use a more contemporary formulation. It does seem to be picking out something real there. Surely there's going to be some relationality. What precisely is of course a different question. But
thank you. Yes, I think actually that's one of the hardest questions facing us right now, to get that balance right between autonomy and right sort of dependence, given that testimony is the core of learning from experts. But thank you, everyone.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with both Ben and Hugh here, right? That we have these competing ideas, sort of these competing concepts of autonomy and trust, and that, right? It seems like our desideratum is something like, we recognizing that we are inextricably in these relationships of trust with others, but at the same time, as you put it, right, we want to think for ourselves, right? We want to be able to reflect on that relationship, right? Whether we ought to be, right? The people that we de facto trust, whether we ought to be trusting them, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Do we have a hand from Honora?
Hello, everybody. Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are. We can hear you.
Good. What I wanted to raise is that perhaps some of the discussion has been focusing on a rather narrow conception of expertise, continually linking it to epistemic competence. And that, of course, is important. But there are many forms of expertise that are more practical and technical. And there's a very good recent book by Roger Kneebone, who is a surgeon, and writes about expertise from a different angle. He is a surgeon who, by the way, works with lace makers, which I think tells one something of what his perspective is. And a great deal of the placing and refusal of trust in everyday life is because I regard the other person as competent or not competent in some practical expertise. And I don't think we should neglect practical expertise in thinking about the question of where to place and where to refuse trust. Thank you.
Yeah, one of the slides I initially had in my talk was distinguishing between, well, the cultural psychologists distinguish between prestige bias and success bias, right? So success bias is being biased towards successful individuals. And so it sounds like that's right. So success bias would account for why we put our trust in those who have a kind of practical expertise, because we can see the fruits of their success. And so I think the epistemic, I think there are interesting epistemic questions around success bias. And I just wanted to sort of make that distinction and suggest that using cues for prestige aren't necessarily interchangeable with cues for success. Although there was an interesting study where they offered people both information about experts' prestige as well as their success rates. And in this particular study, came out published in 2012. Found that people still tended to use cues of prestige rather than cues of success. So maybe in these cases, when we have both kinds of information, the more epistemically responsible thing to do would be to attend to the cues of success.
It may be, as it were, something more generic than success. It's very often competence that people are looking at in everyday life. When you get somebody to mend a leaking tap in your house, you probably aren't really interested in his success in any clearly measurable sense. You're interested in, is he competent? Can he do it? Will he fix it?
No, agreed. We just might be using success and competence in really similar ways, right? So in that case, I'd say that your plumber fixing your leaky pipe is successful, provided that the plumber fixes the pipe. Right? So in this case, I think you would describe that as competence. But I think we're just describing the same thing, but from just using different language.
Success has certain, as it were, ranking implications that competence doesn't.
Oh, okay. I mean, in that, I'm not married to the term success, so I'm happy to use competence in this instance.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much.
Are there any other questions on Charles' talk, or Ben also?
Daniel Antler still has his hand up, but I think it's
no.
previous question. Okay.
Are there any general questions about the conference and our workshop that you want to raise in this final minutes of the...
There's a hand from Maria again.
So it's not a question, just a comment. I want to thank Gloria and Teresa for organizing this incredible conference under really difficult conditions. I enjoyed every moment of it. And I mean, the papers were excellent, but also it was so valuable for the project as a whole. So thank you, Gloria, and thank you, Teresa. Just you've been fantastic under almost impossible conditions. Thanks.
I hope we will be able to gather in Paris next year. and but the COVID will allow us to see each other in person. And I remind you that we expect the papers in their sort of pre-final form. And so I hope that this discussion was fruitful in order to develop your ideas on your papers. And actually, yes, I mean, given that we are missing a speaker, we are earlier, we are in advance. I mean, we are supposed to stop at 6, but if there are no other questions, I will thank you, all of you, for your rich presentations. And I really hope to see you in Paris and in June. We will keep in touch about the details of the conference and the possibilities to keep our conference in Paris. And as Daniel is writing in the chat, if the presenters agree, the recordings of the event will be made available on the project's YouTube channel soon. So if you agree, there will be this possibility to share your presentations with a larger audience. If you don't have any other questions or comments, I just end this meeting and by thank you all again for your participation and interesting discussion, and hope to see you soon in Paris. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Gloria.
Thank you very much.
Bye.